Good morning. I'm Risa Kaufman on behalf of Columbia Law School's Human Rights Institute. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's symposium, Engaging with UN Special Procedures to Advance U.S. Social Justice. We have a very special program in store for you, and we're really happy that you have chosen to join us for what is our 13th annual symposium focused on human rights in the United States. So as we all know, at this very moment, communities throughout the United States are confronting a multitude of human rights concerns: contaminated water supplies, discriminatory policing, criminalization of homelessness, to name just a few. U.S. social justice lawyers, including many of us in this room, are increasingly engaging with UN and regional human rights mechanisms to bring these and other concerns to international attention and then leverage that attention back into our advocacy efforts at home. In the past few years, UN Special Procedures have emerged as a particularly versatile and effective site for this advocacy. I'll pause here and recognize that special procedures is not a term that most U.S. lawyers use on a daily basis. So if you're wondering what exactly the term refers to, I assure you that you're not alone. You'll learn in greater detail throughout the day that special procedures are independent human rights experts appointed by the UN Human Rights Council. They monitor human rights around the world, report on violations, and recommend strategies for governments and other stakeholders to improve conditions within countries. They offer a unique and potentially powerful set of opportunities to raise the profile of U.S. human rights concerns and advance advocacy efforts to address them. U.S. advocates have become sophisticated and highly creative in how they engage with these experts. They're using their engagement with UN Special Procedures to mobilize grassroots communities, raise public awareness, exert international pressure, inform courts, and engage with local, state, and national government officials. And they're doing this in advocacy related to access to reproductive health care, the rights of migrant farm workers, the impact of national security policies, discriminatory criminal justice practices, among many other issues. Today, we'll discuss these and many other examples, and we'll identify opportunities and strategies to ensure that this work has a real impact. Today's topic is a timely one. Several weeks ago, the U.S. State Department announced that 3 UN Special Procedures will make official visits to the United States before the end of this year. These experts will examine areas including freedom of association and assembly, trafficking, and arbitrary detention. These 3 upcoming visits come on the heels of recent visits to the U.S. by the Working Group on Discrimination Against Women and the Working Group of experts on people of African descent. The UN Special Procedures engagement with the U.S. isn't new. Over the past several years, several experts and expert groups have made official visits to the U.S. These include special rapporteurs, independent experts, and working groups with mandates focused on education, poverty, migrants, water and sanitation, housing, violence against women, indigenous peoples, racism, and business and human rights. In the course of these visits, U.S. advocates have played a crucial role by providing experts with background information, arranging consultations with impacted communities, and encouraging and in some cases facilitating conversations with government officials. In addition, U.S. advocates are proactively engaging with special procedures to file complaints on human rights concerns, and they're engaged in more informal and creative advocacy. So today is our opportunity to take stock of these developments and reflect on and perhaps develop some effective strategies for implementing the recommendations of the special procedures to ensure that this work has concrete value. So our goal for today is to develop a deeper understanding of opportunities, strategies, and challenges offered by this UN mechanism for strengthening human rights protections in the United States. To help us achieve this goal, we have a remarkable group of presenters and discussants, including human rights advocates, academics, government officials, and current UN Special Procedures mandate holders, and some who fall into several of those categories. We're also very privileged to have 2 keynote conversations today. We're honored to have Leilani Farha, the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to adequate housing, to provide introductory keynote remarks. And we're privileged to be joined at lunch for a keynote conversation between Juan Mendez, the Special Rapporteur on torture and other cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment, and Stephen Watt, a senior staff attorney at the ACLU's Human Rights Program. We thank all of our speakers and moderators for their participation, for generously sharing their knowledge with us today. Columbia's Human Rights Institute is very proud to sponsor today's event. The Human Rights Institute brings together human rights education, scholarship, and practice at the law school. As part of our project focusing on human rights in the United States, we coordinate the Bringing Human Rights Home Lawyers Network, which connects over 850 lawyers from the domestic civil rights, human rights, and legal services communities to share information and develop strategies for integrating human rights to advance U.S. social justice. If you're not already a member of the network, we encourage you to join, and you can do so on the information table outside this room. We're very privileged to have a wonderful group of co-sponsors for today's program: the American Civil Liberties Union, the National Law Center on Homelessness and Poverty, the National Economic and Social Rights Initiative, and the Center for Reproductive Rights. We're grateful to our co-sponsors, and I'd like to thank in particular Jamil Dakwar, Stephen Watt, Eric Tars, Cathy Albisa, Katrina Anderson, Rebekah Brown, my wonderful colleague Joanne Ward for their help in shaping today's program. An important thank you as well to the Human Rights Institute's program manager, Randy Aho, for her attention to every detail today. So, of course, we also greatly appreciate the law firm of Skadden Arps for generously hosting today's program in this remarkable space. If you have a chance to check out the view, please do so. Skadden engages and encourages pro bono work and supports public interest in human rights advocacy in the United States and around the world. This is the 9th year that Skadden has hosted our symposium, and we're really grateful for their steadfast support. So that does deserve an applause. So. I particularly want to thank Susan Butler-Plum, the director of the Skadden Fellowship Program, and the reason why many of us are in this room today. Most importantly, thank you to all of you, the advocates here, who are working to promote human rights in the United States, for all of the work that you do and for inspiring today's conversation. So just one logistical note for today: if you are here to receive CLE credit, please make sure you sign in and sign out at the end of the day and fill out and return the evaluation form before you leave. So now it's my pleasure to introduce Cathy Albisa, the Executive Director and co-founder of NESRI, the National Economic and Social Rights Initiative, and a commissioner with the New York City Human Rights Commission, to introduce our morning keynote speaker, the Special Rapporteur on Adequate Housing, Leilani Farha.
You don't want to make the introduction to the introducer too long. So I am here to introduce a person, not a procedure. Welcome. I'll start by just noting many of us in this room have witnessed and sometimes done our best to respond to a human rights crisis. Sometimes these crises become the center of the world's attention. Hurricane Katrina was one of those moments. Many people came, many experts came. They wrote articles, they offered their insights for public discourse, sometimes for the cameras when they could, and that was valuable. But few did what Leilani did. Few people from the expert world stayed. In fact, few people came once the furor died down. But several years down the line, 4 years to be exact, when people were still displaced 4 years later, imagine being displaced 4 years later, when they were demolishing public housing at a clip in our country in the midst of an affordable housing crisis and a foreclosure crisis, the only housing that was seen as a public good, when they were propping up banks and not people, when they were applauding rising land prices in urban centers that pushed out poor communities to an uncertain future, that is when Leilani Farha came to New Orleans as part of a UN expert group on forced eviction. But not only did she come after the furor had died down, she did something few others do. She didn't just come and offer her knowledge and insight, which by itself would have had value. She never truly left. Once she saw the crushing housing landscape in our country, once she met the people who were displaced, doubled and tripled up, suffering in the midst of more than enough bricks and mortars and resources to house all our people, I would confidently say she became one of us. She offered an enduring solidarity, concern, and support that you rarely see. You should see the look on her face at some of those meetings. She was very present. She made friends. She remembered people. She is no parachute in and parachute out expert. She is an ally, a friend to those who are struggling to make housing a human right. She is one of those people that represents the moral compass of our movement and our work. She is also the executive director of Canada Without Poverty, and prior to that, served as the executive director of the Center for Equality Rights in Accommodation, and she was a founding member of the International Network on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. I say all that not just to list her bio, but to make it clear that she's always doing double duty. She represents our vision. She is not timid. She has called out the human costs of seeing housing as a commodity, the inequities of organizing housing around an indifferent speculative market. She will name the problem here and anywhere else and join all of those calling for a serious solution. So I am proud and grateful and more than pleased, and with that, introduce Leilani Farha, UN Special Rapporteur on Adequate Housing since May 2014.
That just might be the nicest introduction I've ever had. Thank you so much. I got all choked up. I had all these visual images. The visual images of New Orleans still with me so many years later, of course, and Detroit too. I'm just going to do a technological thing. I'm not very good at fixing my own slides, Randy. If I gave you a copy of the presentation, could you do the slides? Because it's written out, and I brought an extra copy, and it says exactly what slide when. I do try to keep things easy. First of all, I'd like to thank Risa for not just inviting me here, which is wonderful. I mean, New York is wonderful, even if you arrive at 11:40 p.m. And have to leave at 4 p.m. the next day. I am very pleased to be here, but also to Risa for all of the work that you're doing that absolutely supports the work that we're all doing collectively. So very important. I have relied on your work, as you know, in my own work, and I will continue to do so. So thank you very much. And again, Cathy, a formal thanks for that introduction and for everything that you do. We are allies, in step with each other. So, no, slide one. That's the title. So what's so special about a special rapporteur? I was appointed special rapporteur exactly 2 years ago. And to be honest, despite the fact that I had used the special procedures in my NGO work and was friends and colleagues with a number of special rapporteurs, it was only once I was appointed that I started to have a vision of what a special rapporteur can do. Yes, it's true. The superhero fantasies of yore resurfaced. I really did have this sense, I'm going to change the world. And then I settled down and reality hit. And of course, reality is quite different. I expend a huge amount of time and effort to effect incremental change at best. In fact, no different from any other position I have held over the last 20 years. However, I do think the doors open slightly easier and slightly wider because of the title. And that's what I try to harness and use in my work. I understand that the next panel will tackle the function of special rapporteurs, the sort of nitty-gritty of our work. So I'm not going to do that. Instead, I'm going to focus on how the mechanism can be used to contribute to the struggle for the realization of human rights globally. In other words, I'm going to focus on what makes the position and not the person special. And then I'll throw in a few challenges as well. So, the top 5 things special rapporteurs can do to make a difference. I'd like to do the top 10, but as some of you will know, this is a completely under and unresourced position. So I think I'm going to go with 5. Here we go. Unlike David Letterman, I'm not going to offer these in any particular order, although I think the first one, which is the 5th one, is actually the most important. Supporting advocacy. So regardless of what I do, regardless of what aspect of my work I'm engaging, whether it's a country visit, a communication, a working visit, the aim, in my opinion, should be to support or assist local groups. In my short tenure, I think the best example is the work I did with the Special Rapporteur on Water and Sanitation, Katerina de Albuquerque, with some groups in Detroit. Yes. The water shutoff crisis had already commenced by the time I had been appointed, in fact. And groups, local groups, domestic groups in the U.S. and in Detroit specifically had already started to mobilize. They had taken to the streets. They were and are an organized bunch. And then they contacted us, and we agreed to act. So we filed an urgent appeal along with the Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty. In that case, we were writing a letter to the federal government here, the national level government here, saying, you've got a major problem on your hands. In fact, it's a human rights crisis, and you have to deal with it. And it's in Detroit. And it's keeping people from having water, and therefore adequate housing, adequate water and sanitation. We then followed that by issuing a press release that garnered a huge amount of attention. The U.S. media is good this way. They pick up on things. They like a story, and they took it. We then decided at the invitation of some groups to do a city, what we call a city working visit. So it's not an official mission. We're invited in by NGOs, and we go and we work. And it was completely organized and exceptionally well organized by the local groups. It included a town hall, site visits, and a meeting with the mayor. And we followed that on the ground with a press conference, which was massive. Every major news outlet was there, including international news. The results. Well, we did not end the water shutoffs in Detroit. Of course not. But I think we did lend support to the local groups. They were struggling in a domestic context, and they needed something from the outside, something bigger than the U.S. to say, this is wrong. In the richest country in the world, the most developed country, supposedly, in the world, this is wrong. So, of course, the challenge with a city visit like that is remaining connected. How do I, so busy running around the world doing a million things, how do I remain connected to the folks in Detroit? And so I leave that as a challenge. Number 4. Oh, you're not keeping up, Randy. Got to read the script. Number 4. One of the things, this says change laws. I was using shorthand. We can help to change laws. I think our country visits are the best way into that aspect of the job. They often, you land on the ground and you learn about some law that's in the making, and you think, I can assist with this. And then literally, I've sat across from government officials, they're talking about a new law, and I'll say, well, my job is to assist you in crafting that law to make sure that it's compliant with international human rights law. I had that experience in Serbia, and this is not from Serbia. I'll tell you about this experience as well. I had that experience in Serbia where they were drafting a new housing law, and Serbia was uniquely positioned at the time, still is. They're trying to, unlike some countries, they're trying to get into the EU. Welcome to the New World Order. Crazy. Anyway, I haven't caught up on all the news, but whoa. Anyway, so Serbia is trying to get into the EU. Maybe they're wondering, should we not? Should we? And to get into the EU, believe it or not, their laws have to be compliant with EU laws, and EU laws aren't so bad in the area of human rights and housing, at least on paper. And so I heard that they were they were in the process of developing a law on housing. Over time, I liaised closely with the Office of the High Commissioner on-the-ground staff in Serbia after my visit. And we had a whole back and forth with lots of translation, trying to get that law to be more progressive. There were some pretty draconian things in that law around forced evictions. And so just, weighing in and then using my position, because I'm in Geneva all the time, you get to know the different ambassadors, et cetera, that are there. So using my friendship and close relationship with the Serbian ambassador and his first secretary to get them to put pressure back on the lawmakers back home. We still await a result in that, but certainly we managed to slow down the process, which was key because they were wanting to ram through this pretty regressive law. In India, where I visited most recently, I highlighted a number of things when I was there on the ground, but one of the things that I highlighted was discrimination against Muslims in the rental sector. And I don't know if anyone here knows much about India, but highlighting discrimination against Muslims, it's predominantly Hindu society. So highlighting discrimination against Muslims is exceptionally sensitive there, and I had been told that. So I used the sensitivity to kind of rock a little bit. And the government was very unhappy with me when I presented to them my statement before presenting it to the media. And they were really on about that. So I realized, this is definitely their Achilles. So let's go for it. So I shored up, what do you do, right? So I shored up that aspect of my statement to the media, made sure it was rock solid, based in evidence, et cetera, et cetera. The media went wild with it. And since I've come back, we've learned that the new real estate bill is trying to deal with this. We don't know if this is going to be effective, if it'll be implemented, and there's all of those challenges, but a small step. I can't take credit for that. There was lots of stuff going on the ground around discrimination against Muslims. I had seen it in the media prior to visiting, but there's no doubt that it provides just that extra little bit of pressure when an internationalist comes in, supposedly an expert, saying this is wrong, this is a problem, needs to be addressed. Okay. Number 3. Provoke. As you can probably tell, this is one of my favorite things to do. So, we are independent experts. I don't represent, in this role, I don't represent an NGO, I don't represent government, and I do not work for or am employed by the UN. And I have to say, it is so effing liberating to be so completely independent. No matter what meeting I'm in, no matter what country I'm in, the sense of independence enables me to speak truth. And my guide is human rights law. So I'm always on firm ground. I'm always on. Now, my analysis might be pathetic. It might not be fulsome, of course. But I can say things that need to be said and that ought to be said. So that's one example of provoking. That article in The Guardian had it had 170,000 shares. Now, I'm not really into this, but the people around me tell me this is very cool because Boris Johnson, who everyone loves in the UK, or a lot of people do, doesn't get 170,000 shares for his op-eds. So clearly this did something. Now, who shared it? I don't know. Is it just us, in this room, sharing it with each other back and forth 100 times? Remember that article? It could be. It could be. But my idea is, in the role, is to try to speak truth and be bold and put things out there that need to be said. They're not always being said. Sometimes I sit in a room. I was in a room last week in Ottawa, where I live, with a whole bunch of government people, and everyone was being so polite. And I'm thinking, okay, we've got a massive homelessness problem in this country. We have an Indigenous problem in this country. And you would never have known it if I hadn't have said something. And so it's an important thing to do. And because we're independent experts appointed by the Human Rights Council, we are afforded a certain legitimacy. And so if I say what someone else might say, it gets taken in a certain way because of the position. And so there are a number of us that try to do this. I think Philip Alston is exceptionally good. You all presumably know he's the Special Rapporteur on extreme poverty. I think he's exceptionally good at doing this. There are limitations in our ability to provoke, though, because we can't focus in on one country only. You know, if I start hammering the U.S. over and over and over, I get labeled not international. You know, I'm supposed to be regionally representative, et cetera. So one of the things I've noticed Philip doing is attacking institutions, and that we can do. So he has attacked the World Bank, and he has attacked the UN. And I have been in stride with him, along with three other special rapporteurs, in attacking and provoking the UN. And that refers, if you go back one slide, Randy, that article there at the bottom, UN's own experts chastise Ban Ki-moon over handling of Haiti cholera epidemic. I don't know how many of you will know of this, but when the UN brought in peacekeeping forces to Haiti, they also brought with them cholera, which had never been there before. And it has killed many, many people and caused many, many people to be very ill. And we thought it was appropriate to hold the UN accountable as special rapporteurs. I mean, we're within the system. And so we've been moving in that regard, much to the UN's chagrin, as you can well imagine. But that provocative role is really important, both within institutions and from the outside. Okay, now 2 slides forward. Yes. And Risa, I'm assuming you're going to tell me if I'm taking way too long. I haven't timed this, or someone will. Okay, you will. Thank you. Developing new legal standards. We are actually not supposed to develop new legal standards. But I think that we do. I think we do it in a kind of backdoor way. And the way that we do it is we harness existing standards and try to elaborate on them, shall we say. I actually think this is one of the most interesting areas of the work. Because we're constantly surveying the landscape, in my case, what's happening globally with respect to the right to adequate housing? What are the sore points? What's missing? What isn't happening? It allows us to then think, okay, I want to fill this gap. And it's a very important thing to do, excuse me, because the bodies that do set legal standards, like the UN Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights and other treaty monitoring bodies, have a slower process and a potentially more, but compromised process, because they have to reach consensus as a committee to adopt a general comment, for example. Whereas I don't need consensus I only need consensus with myself. I do, of course, have to consult widely, but I have that capacity as special rapporteur. I can meet with NGOs, I can hold consultations, etc. And so it enables us to kind of quite quickly draft what can be quite progressive positions in the thematic area for which we're responsible. The 2 examples I wanted to give are from my predecessor's work. So Raquel Rolnick, who was the rapporteur before me in the area of housing, developed security of tenure principles. And those are being used quite widely, as I understand it. And I certainly try to use them in my work, and I bring them wherever I go, etc. Maloon Kothari, who was the very first special rapporteur on the right to adequate housing, and you can actually, Randy, go to the next slide. I forgot to put it in there. He developed what are called development-based displacement guidelines, basically dealing with forced evictions. And in the case of development, where development is pushing out people from their homes. And those guidelines have been used extensively and, in my opinion, very effectively. The High Court of Delhi has referred to them in a decision affecting around the lack of land for people who were living in informal settlements who were evicted. The Kenya, I don't know, is it the High Court? Someone in this room will know, suggested that the guidelines become part of their national law. It's pretty cool. And the Mexican Supreme Court, just recently in the last 2 years, issued a protocol which is intended to serve as a reference for judges as they adjudicate cases where displacement may happen. And the guidelines were used in the development of that protocol, and the protocol is consistent with the guidelines. I have yet to develop a discrete set of guidelines or principles in that kind of form, but I've been trying to use my position to influence processes that are underway, legal standards that are being set as we speak. So, for example, the Committee on the Rights of the Child is in the midst of developing a general comment on children in street situations. And Eric is nodding, and I'm hoping you're going to weigh in on this. Or if you already have, yay. If you haven't, you should. They started developing children in street situations. Okay, to me, I'm hearing homeless. In some way, shape, or form. I'm hearing kids living in situations that are inadequate and then being pulled to the street or forced to the street. I got a copy of the first initial draft. There was no mention of the right to an adequate standard of living in the general comment. Question mark. And no references to homelessness and the right to adequate housing specifically. Question mark. So I had a meeting with the committee. They were open to hearing from me, and I get, because I'm a special rapporteur, they give me like 30 minutes one-on-one time, which you wouldn't get if you're an NGO necessarily, and with, the key committee members. I'm in the midst of dealing with the Human Rights Committee's general comment on the right to life, which has yet to embrace the idea that the right to life has positive obligations attached to it and might, in fact, have something to do with economic and social rights. And so I have a one-on-one with them in July, and I hope to be able to influence that process. And then in my own reports, especially the homelessness report that I just released, I've been really trying to push our understanding to a human rights place. So much of what happens with housing happens on the policy front, and policy gets conflated with human rights, and they aren't always the same. Good policy should be the same as human rights, but general housing policy tends not to be human rights oriented. So I use the homelessness report, for example, to come up with what I think is a human rights definition of homelessness, rather than just these definitions that governments use so that they can show that they're solving the problem. Okay, number 5, and this is the last one, educate. And I don't have much to say here, except that everything I do is education. Educate, educate, educate. That's all. In fact, that's really what I do. It amazes me what's not known, and what's not known by whom. I was told yesterday or the day before yesterday, for example, that the Prime Minister of Canada, I was told this by one of his parliamentary secretaries, that the Prime Minister of Canada isn't so keen on economic and social rights because he doesn't want to have to engage in constitutional debates and reform. In other words, he doesn't want to open up our Charter of Rights and Freedoms for further negotiations to add new rights to it. I'm thinking, what does he think the right to life means? We have the right to life in our Constitution. What does he think that means? Why does he think we need to open up the Charter? Why doesn't he think that we could, in fact, do economic and social rights through the right to life? Because we can do, not all of it, but we can do a big portion. We can certainly address homelessness that way. So there is so much education to be done. There isn't a meeting I go to with NGOs to tell them about this position and what it means and how they can exploit it, with governments to tell them that the right to adequate housing is a human right, and that when it's in their constitution, they should be able to, people should be able to implement it. Governments don't know the standards that attach to rights. They don't know what their obligations are. Even more so, subnational governments know nothing about this stuff on the whole. And yet many have embraced the idea of the human rights city, but they don't know that, in fact, doing that is meeting their international human rights obligations. They don't always put the pieces together. So a huge education piece, but also a huge piece of learning for me. There isn't a meeting that I go to where I don't learn something, whether it's learning a new strategy, learning new information, learning something new about the law, and certainly I'm always learning about new domestic context. Last slide, yes. So I would conclude with this, and it looks like I'm in good time. Yay, never happens. First time I've done this presentation, so didn't know about my timing. This is what I would say in conclusion. I think sometimes I do wish I was a superhero and that I could swoop in and make change like that. But my vision of the role is that wouldn't be right, and that the way to do this is to do it in stride with all of you, with the people that I meet who are already engaged in huge struggles to enjoy their human rights and ensure the most vulnerable are enjoying their human rights. And that my role really is to walk in stride with the real advocates. Thank you.
This button. Okay. How long? So we have 15 minutes for Q&A if people have questions for Leilani. So I'll ask you my first question.
Break the ice.
I'll break the ice. Yes, I meant to mention Detroit, and I skipped it over in my notes, but thank you for that visit as well. It was very powerful, and people are still very appreciative. What has been the most frustrating moment since you had the mandate?
That's a good question.
It's an Oprah question.
It's an easy one in a way. I have to admit, the lack of resources, because I'm not paid, so then I have this other job that I have to do, which I don't do very well anymore. And I have a very small team, so I have enough resources. So I have an assistant in Geneva who works with me full time. And then I have a very small team. I have a senior advisor. Many of you will know him, Bruce Porter. But I only have enough resources, so he works maybe part-time, not even part-time. And then I have enough resources for a part-time communications person. And now I just hired an executive assistant because I was like double booking meetings and missing things and just not doing my job as effectively as I could. But and I have a creative coordinator in Buenos Aires, actually, who I met through ESCR Net, which is kind of cool, many, many moons ago. And she's developing a website, and so I'm doing a whole we're doing this thing called Seeing Is ... believing, understanding, knowing, and we're trying to bring visuals into the mandate because rapporteurs tend not to do a lot of visual work, and yet, of course, we all know it's pretty much a visual world these days, and it's how I think, too. I'm quite visual. So it's a small team, and everyone's working part-time, and everyone has another job, and I know that these roles, special rapporteur roles, could be incredible if we had resources. So I have to say that for me is it's a big barrier. Okay, I'm an ideas person. Every day, I would say I have at least 3 pretty good ideas, in my opinion, and mostly in the shower. I have to admit, it's crazy, busy, and noisy in that shower every morning. But really, like, I get these ideas. We should do this. We should do this, and I can make maybe 2 ideas come alive in a year. Right, like real big ideas come alive. One of the ideas I had is to do a global right to housing campaign, a very high level. I mean, like the HIV/AIDS campaigns, the water and sanitation campaigns, because housing needs this. And I've been in conversation with a few people about this, and it's just, how do you get that off the ground when you have 0 resources? I have a pro bono creative team working with me in Toronto on it, but they're pro bono, so, so putting into action ideas. One thing I did manage to do at the Human Rights Council, it was the first time it had ever been done. This was one of my ideas early in the mandate. I said, I want visuals. When I present at the Human Rights Council, it's all these people in suits, and they're on their phones, and they're barely listening, and I'm presenting on life and death matters, the most, in my opinion, the most egregious violations of human rights, and they're like, it's just all too comfortable. So I wanted to bring some visuals in, and so we worked the bureaucracy, and for the first time at the last session, while I presented, there were these huge screens on either side of me, and visuals of homelessness were projected on the screens. And I don't know what difference it made to the bureaucrats in the room, but it made a big difference to me.
Okay, good. Got people going. Let's go 1, 2, 3, 4.
So, Leilani, I just wanted to follow. Okay. I just wanted to follow up Cathy's question and say, as advocates, how can we, is there some way we can force the resource issue? Is there somebody we can write to within the council? Anything we can do? Because we'll organize around that. And I've heard the same frustration from Raquel also. So
Let's take a round first, because we don't have a lot of time for Q&A, so she can answer them all at once. Model up your answers.
Hi. I was wondering if you could talk specifically about your experiences in the United States. What's been the most effective interventions that you've been able to make, either at the local, state, or national level? How has the government interacted with you and received you and engaged in those recommendations? Thanks.
It's, first of all, so exciting for me to see you up here in this position. And the question I have is, we worked together for years in trying to get special rapporteurs to engage on our issues. And now that you're in this position, how do you go about choosing your priorities? And what are the factors that you think of for those of us who are trying to get your other mandates to engage with our issues?
Back there. Yeah, she's got it.
Just to piggyback on the resources question, what can we do as advocates approaching you to fast forward things or to bring our resources, particularly in the United States, where we may have more access to funding and things and other opportunities to increase the impact, but what would be most helpful? Help us help you or something.
So what are the best ways to help us help you while we figure out your priorities?
Can I add one question? Sorry. It's me.
Oh.
For folks who are kind of new to this, how do they know how they can fit on your agenda? So we had the question about what your priorities are, but how can advocates best plug into that?
All right.
It's so nice people taking seriously the resource question. Lots of times I'll say it and it's like a lead balloon in a room. Let me deal with that first. It makes my life easy if NGOs have resources and they say, or institutions have resources and they say, we've got resources, do you want to come? We'll put you up in a hotel and, feed you. if you just play your role. And so, that works. And here I am, thanks to the resources provided for me here today. I don't think there's anything NGOs can do directly with the council. I mean, of course, we can keep putting pressure, but I mean, we talk about this, the rapporteurs talk about this all the time. And I mean, I whine and complain, and I actually do get some resources. There are mandates that get 0 resources. So, you can imagine. And then there are others that get mega resources. So human rights defenders, freedom of expression, they get mega. The country-specific mandates, 0. So I should bracket my comments that way. We need to encourage U.S. foundations to understand that, economic and social rights should be funded, and not just by the Ford Foundation, but by other foundations, et cetera, and sort of just keep that momentum. But I think ESCRNet and others, your organization as well, I'm sure you're engaged in those conversations with funders. The question about my most effective interventions and in the U.S., I think Detroit, I mean, I've done Detroit and Flint have been my 2 U.S.-based interventions, and I've done a number on Detroit, and I think 2 on Flint. And I think Detroit has been more successful than Flint, and I think that's because the NGOs invited us on a working visit. And we're just so close. Like, there's just, I actually have to say about the U.S. government, they engage. And they engage they're pretty forthcoming. They will be blunt, like, we haven't ratified the ICSCR. We have ratified CERD. We take on board this could be discrimination based on race. Like, they're pretty. That's not bad for a government, I can tell you that. Like, they're not. They show a little bit of humility, unlike other governments. My own government. No one tweet that.
Tweet what?
Yeah, exactly. So I don't know what to say. There is this problem. Detroit is a subnational government problem as much as it is a national level government problem. And there is that problem because although it did force Detroit to go, whoa, the mayor was freaked out, right? Because the federal government was calling the mayor saying, you got a problem on your hands. And so that's lovely, that interaction, and we were really pushing that. But then when we met with the mayor, complete hostility. Now, I think he tinkered with the plan, the 10-point plan or whatever, after we left, right? So, but at the national level and internationally right now, I don't know what happens if you all elect Donald Trump, but right now there is engagement, and I would call it constructive engagement. Rebekah, how do we choose priorities? It's such a good question, and it's like you fly by the seat of your pants. I mean, you're being hit with, like this week, I received, what day is it? Friday. Yeah, so between Monday and Wednesday, I received 3 urgent appeal requests. That's where I write to a government on an urgent basis, like I did with Detroit. And all 3 were imminent evictions. Vietnam, Kyrgyzstan, I forget where the third one was. See? And how am I can't do all of them. I cannot do all of them, although I would like to move to a template system where we just throw in a few facts and just fire something off. But part of the problem is I am a little bit, people have called me a perfectionist. I'm not sure that's the right word. I read everything that goes out in my name, and so it takes me a little bit longer. I'm very serious about the law, and so I ask very tough, what I consider to be fairly tough and rigorous legal questions, and not all communications do that. So how do I choose the one that looks the most imminent? That's in that case. How I'm choosing my priorities in terms of thematic reports. That's my sense of the landscape. So I knew homelessness needed to be addressed again. Maloon, my predecessor, had addressed it, but I knew I needed to go because homelessness has changed in the 12 years since he had written his report, you know? So I was like, no, we got to revisit this and amp it up because I know the media likes homelessness and states hate it. I've never sat across from a government official who was proud of the homelessness in their country. Never. So, and no one denies it. So no government official will deny it. My next report, my report to the GA, is on the right to life and the right to housing. I feel that the Human Rights Committee is on a bit of a campaign, so I decided to launch my own campaign. I mean, it's like ballsy or whatever, but that's, you know, and my next report to the my next report to the Human Rights Council is going to be on what I think is also a key issue of our day, the huge emphasis on economic growth in cities and real estate, property, all of that at the expense of human rights. And trying to, I'm gonna out Blackstone big time. I mean, they've already been outed, but I'd like to join in that from a human rights place. So that's really, I'm just surveying. What do I think is going to have traction? What are groups telling me? Like, I mean, the number of people talking about this. I was just in Barcelona, and I mean, it's like the issue there, and so, you know, it's like a weird mix of things. And then what do I feel passionate about? Because, I mean, as any advocate in the room knows, you're the best advocate when you feel passionate about the things. So, you know, that's how I try to do it. What else? Did I miss anything? How to get on my agenda if you don't know the... So, I have a web page. Oh, it's not on there. I guess we took it off. Sorry, I was looking at that. I have a web page that explains me, my mandate, etc. And you can get a pretty good sense of whether your issue is going to fit. But if your issue is multiple, like Detroit is extreme poverty, it is water and sanitation, it is housing, we could have gone further, it is health, it is, we could even do minorities, you know. You can, in fact, approach one of us, and if we don't feel it's appropriate, we will put it out to other people. I get things all the time on water and sanitation where it's just a little bit too technical and not so clearly housing, where I'll, you know, pass it to water san. We have a little bit of a troika, I call it a troika, water, san, extreme poverty, and housing. We work really well together. We all like each other. We know each other. And so that's a nice grouping. And then we'll bring in health when we need to. He has a slightly different way of working, and so, but he's always game. So that's what I would say. Send an email, ask. We're pretty open, and now I have an EA monitoring all of my emails, so actually you might get a response. Do we have more time? Yeah. Okay.
All right, I think we're done.
Thank you, Leilani, for that incredibly inspiring opening and for the work you do. We're going to get started on our first panel right away, so if folks would come to the front for the first panel. Yes. Oh, this is me. I'll use this one so you can use that one.
Hi.
Hey there.
Hi, you snuck back in here. Okay.
I think so, yeah.
So Rob and Madeline, you both have PowerPoint.
Okay.
So this is your clicker.
Okay.
Madeline, you'll be first.
Yeah.
And I'll pull it up. Hello.
I have 60 seconds to run to the bathroom.
Yeah. And I'll pull yours up for you too, okay?
Thank you.
Hello,
Hi.
I'm Ted Piccone.
Hi.
We only met on the phone briefly
Okay.
the other day.
How are you?
How are you?
Good. This makes my day.
I know.
When I first came to Nesri, they were all down in New Orleans working on forced evictions. And Nesri tried to collaborate with the Right to the City Alliance. I was a picture of the homeless and a member of Right to the City. So somebody called me and I got the tip and he said, well, Rob, you connected to Right to the City. Maybe you can help them come together. And I ended up going to Nesri after that. And, and then met Leilani in 2013. So this is like great for me.
I know. So Leilani and I used to be a DS here in it.
Oh, okay.
And Leilani and I started working together in 2007. And it's just like so exciting for me to see her.
Exactly. Like folks started reaching out to me after my relationship with Raquel and saying, listen, we got to get her elected. And I was like, no, I just went full steam ahead. I didn't hesitate. I just pushed, you know what happened. So.
Yeah, I think everyone was really surprised, because also being the politics of the UN and her being from Canada.
But we pushed on the ground.
Yeah.
Those of us that knew her, I just got writing every time. Thea asked me to write something, I just keep writing.
Yeah.
Thank you. You were good. It worked out well.
No, it's so important who holds these mandates. The person, like if they're just there for their career, someone who's a really passionate activist in the role makes
And that's it, for me, it's been a blessing. I've met all three and, have a relationship with all three actors. When we had the official mission with her, she kept seeing me trying to force a relationship. And she sat me down and said, look, they're working with the UN. Don't be surprised if you can't make that relationship happen. So just Raquel supported me, got her staff to interact with me, and we just built this relationship. And then I just got to know them all and, work with them on a regular basis. I can email them, I get an instant response, and it's been powerful to take that back into the community. Right? So,
absolutely.
When they reached out to, I'll tell the story a little bit, when they reached out to Detroit, when Detroit reached out to them, I wrote her behind the scenes, so it'd be great if you could come too. So they collaborated.
Yeah.
Let me just grab a video off them. How long were you at the ESC on that?
I was there for 5 years.
Wow.
When I left, I was the deputy director.
Okay, when did you leave?
In 2013.
I'm surprised we never.
Because I was. So before I was the deputy director, I oversaw the strategic litigation work. But I think you mostly worked with Thea, right?
Right.
Yeah. So Thea was there, and all the coordinators sort of took the lead in most of their areas.
Right.
So I mostly engaged just with the sort of folks that were doing litigation work. I had met, I'd been in touch with Cathy a bit.
She's been an incredible
I was
mentor
there.
for me as I come through this journey.
Yeah, Cathy's amazing.
Okay.
I think we're missing Madeleine. Yeah. Okay. Okay, good morning, everyone. I think we're going to get started with the next panel. So my name is Rebekah Brown. I'm the Director of Global Advocacy with the Center for Reproductive Rights, and I oversee all of the center's work with the UN, and I have the pleasure of engaging with all of the special procedures that we'll be discussing today. And on behalf of the center, I'd like to thank Columbia Law for hosting and allowing the center to co-sponsor the event. As I said, we have a very long history of engaging with the special procedures, some of the ones that you'd think would be more traditional for reproductive rights, such as health, violence against women. And my colleague, Katrina Anderson, will discuss more specifically some of that work this afternoon. But we've also engaged with mandates around torture, which you'll hear from later today, independence of judges, human rights defenders. And I just want to say, because we're going to hear from all of our panelists right now, more specifics on why and how, but I really want to reiterate the points that Leilani made and really illustrated really well. The special procedures, we have chose to engage with them extensively because they're able to be bold and reactive and also really comprehensive in the way that they address human rights violations. Some of the treaty bodies, you know, their mandates, they take their mandates sometimes they interpret them a little too narrowly. And I think, you know, something that Leilani was saying to you in terms of her making the connections between the right to housing and the right to life and how clearly fundamental those connections are. But also Professor Mendez, who you will be hearing from later, has done really pioneering work on connecting torture, cruel and inhumane and degrading treatment, and reproductive rights violations and gender-based violence. And I think the special rapporteurs have really done some pioneering and important work in maybe not the development of human rights law, but framing human rights law in a way that makes redressing violations more holistic. So let me introduce to you our three panelists. We're going to start with Madeleine Sinclair, who's the New York Office Director and Legal Counsel at the International Service for Human Rights here in New York. Madeleine leads ISHR's work to combat reprisals against human rights defenders and coordinates ISHR's legal work and strategic litigation. We're also going to hear from Ted Piccone, Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institute. Ted's research is focused on global democracy and human rights policies, U.S.-Latin American relations, including Cuba, emerging powers, and multilateral affairs. And we'll also hear from Rob Robinson on the leadership committee of the Take Back the Land movement and a staff volunteer at NESRI. In 2009, Rob was chosen to be New York City chairperson for the first official mission of the former UN Special Rapporteur on the right to housing, Raquel Rolnick. So let's start with Madeleine. Madeleine, can you give us a general overview of the special procedures? What and who are they? What is the source of their authority? How they function and their relationship to the variety of human rights mechanisms?
How do I bring up my PowerPoint? Just hit play?
Randy is... Randy?
In the meantime, hi everyone, and thank you to the organizers for having me here this morning. I'm very happy to be here. As Rebekah said, I work for an NGO called the International Service for Human Rights. We are a Geneva and New York-based human rights organization that works to support human rights defenders and to strengthen human rights systems, one of them being the UN human rights system. And we are avid users of the special procedures and the other UN human rights mechanisms, but we also train national-level human rights defenders on how best to utilize them in their work as well. This is not the beginning. Let's see. All right, this is the beginning. So my presentation is going to be the sort of 30,000 feet big picture presentation, very much sort of an introduction to the whole system. Probably going to raise a lot of questions, which will be, maybe we'll answer some of those in this panel, and hopefully all of them will be answered by the end of the day. And thanks to that great introduction, I think it's all going to be a little bit more intelligible because you already have some real-world examples of what I'm going to try and explain in terms of what the special procedures do. This is a special procedure, as was mentioned. They are people. This is Mina Kai, the Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Association and Assembly, who will be visiting the U.S. later this year. So who are they? They are human rights experts. They go by several names: special rapporteur, independent expert, working groups, ad hoc working groups. These are all special procedures. They are the special rapporteurs and independent experts are individuals, and the working groups obviously are groups of individuals working together. And they're mandated to examine, report, monitor, research, and advise on human rights situations, either from a country perspective or on a specific theme. So there are 14 country mandates right now. I'll show you a list of them in a second. Country mandates generally last 1 year, as opposed to the thematic mandates, of which there are currently 41. Thematic mandates generally last 3 years. Country mandates are generally harder to establish because these are, we'll get to how they're established, but they're politically negotiated resolutions. So they are harder to establish for obvious reasons, and they are harder to continue once they are established. Whereas the thematic mandates are actually hard to get rid of once they're established. I think there's only been one in history that has been discontinued, and it was actually just merged with another, which is why the system has also grown and grown and grown and continues to grow. As we sit here, there will probably be another special rapporteur created in the next week or so, as the Human Rights Council is now negotiating a resolution to create an independent expert on sexual orientation and gender identity. So these are the current 14 country mandates, sort of a hit list of hot human rights situations, but there'll be obvious countries missing from this list, notably any of the P5 members who will, most likely never be on this list. And this is a list of thematic mandates. I don't know how that's going to show up if you can read them even, but it's really quite a long list of huge range of issues, and as I said, always growing. So how is a mandate established? As I mentioned, it's a political negotiation of a resolution. So the Human Rights Council meets 3 times a year, negotiates a series of resolutions, and of these resolutions, some of them create special rapporteurs, special procedures. A resolution is led by a state alone or by a group of states. Generally, when it's a group of states, it's called a core group, and it usually represents states from different regions in the world. So for example, the resolution on the independent expert on sexual orientation and gender identity is being led by a group of Latin American states currently. And then once a resolution establishes a mandate, an appointment process takes place. So it's advertised much like a job opening. OHCHR puts out the call. OHCHR, is the Office for the High Commissioner for Human Rights, which is the human rights branch of the UN. And anyone can nominate somebody to become a special procedure. A list of candidates is advertised. It's open. Everyone can see who's applied. And then a small group of states, it's called the consultative group, 1 member from each of the 5 regional groups, so these are basically ambassadors in Geneva. They meet and they draw up a short list, usually 3 or so. And they pass that short list on to the president of the Human Rights Council, which is also a rotating regional position, currently occupied by South Korea. And he will then make his pick. It sounds a bit arbitrary, but he does do a lot of he or she, it's a he now, does do a lot of consultation to ensure that that appointment will go over smoothly with other countries. And then eventually the Human Rights Council meets to essentially ratify that decision and approve the list. These are the general criteria for appointment. I wish they were features of every special procedure. They're not always, unfortunately. The best ones meet all these criteria, and those here today would be in that category, but unfortunately, independence, expertise, impartiality are not always perfectly met because, again, countries want to see their people nominated and appointed, and there needs to be some geographic balance, and unfortunately, that is often a criteria that is really emphasized over others. So what can a special procedure do? We basically got a great and really sort of substantive presentation on that already, but essentially, to go over it again, special procedures can conduct country visits. So generally, they do these formally at the request. A state can invite a special procedure to visit, or a special procedure can request to visit, and the state has to accept. And some countries have what we call standing invitations. So they say, in principle, we're happy for special procedures to visit whenever they want. But some of those standing invitations are not what we call meaningful. So a country might say, yeah, we're open to special procedures coming. And when it comes time, they'll write to the government, say, I'd like to come, in October. And they say, well, actually, that doesn't suit us. And say, oh, well, I'd like to come in December. Well, that doesn't suit us either. So they don't end up actually being able to visit. And some special procedures have a much easier time getting into countries than others, for obvious reasons. But there are, as Leilani mentioned, ways to visit countries informally, being invited by NGOs, for example, to participate in consultations. And, some countries don't mind that at all. Others mind that very much. So it's sort of an informal practice. The next big sort of tool in the toolbox is communications. The example this morning was on Detroit, the urgent appeal. So there are two types of communications, letters of allegation and urgent appeals, the main difference being that urgent appeals are dealing with sort of imminent, loss of life, imminent threat situations, whereas letters of allegations are more designed to sort of allow the government to respond to an allegation of a human rights violation. And these are sent individually by one mandate or, as was mentioned again this morning, jointly. And increasingly, rapporteurs are sending joint communications. Those are seen to be a bit stronger when more of them are joining together. They can issue press releases as well. And they can prepare the thematic reports that were mentioned. And they can also, sorry, I got my 2-minute warning. Conduct advocacy and awareness raising. Leilani touched a lot on this morning, so I won't go into that, and working directly with governments to advise on human rights policies, which, with more funding, they would be able to do a lot more of, frankly. Let's see. In terms of how civil society can engage. So one of the main ways that civil society can engage is to send communications, to send information to special procedures and ask them to either send a letter of allegation or an urgent appeal. They can also just informally or formally provide special procedures with information about ongoing situations. They can raise awareness about the special procedures work and sort of amplify that work. Participate in country visits, either when a country visit occurs or by lobbying a government to accept a visit or lobbying a rapporteur to request a visit. Contributing to thematic reports, as was mentioned. There's often a call that goes out for contributions, sometimes through a questionnaire ahead of the reports. And most procedures are writing 2 reports a year, one to the Human Rights Council and one to the General Assembly. Some of them only report to the Human Rights Council, but the vast majority report to both. So there's sort of 2 opportunities a year to write a thematic report. And then events like this, inviting special procedures to participate in initiatives. And then I put down, finally, nominate candidates. Okay, very quickly. It's going to take a little longer than 30 seconds, but I'll be fast. I just want to signpost sort of where the special procedures fit in terms of other mechanisms, because they are, again, sort of one mechanism in the sort of, the menu of different bodies and mechanisms within the UN. So I mentioned the Universal Periodic Review, the treaty bodies, and then the complaints procedure of the Human Rights Council and commissions of inquiries. Those are the sort of 4 main other human rights bodies and mechanisms one might consider. And whether one chooses to approach a special rapporteur over one of these others has to be a calculation based on, is it an urgent situation? Some of these mechanisms respond quickly, as rapporteurs do. Some of them respond very, very slowly. For example, a complaint to a treaty body. Some of them involve trying to get political pressure exerted on a situation, and some of them involve expert pressure. So you have to decide, which one would be more helpful in this situation. Is it helpful to have confidentiality on your side? Do you think a state will cooperate? Some states will cooperate more if it's dealt with confidentially, whereas others won't cooperate unless it's public, if that public pressure isn't brought to bear. So maybe because my time's up, I won't get into the details of each of these, but we can obviously talk about it if there are specific questions, and I'll just leave it there.
Great, thanks, Madeleine. Ted, can you talk to us a little bit about your experience with effectiveness of the special procedures and some of the limitations and challenges that you've seen?
Sure, and thank you, organizers, for bringing us together and for inviting me. For those who don't know, Brookings... How's that? Okay. For those who don't know, Brookings is an independent, nonpartisan think tank in Washington. We're celebrating our 100-year anniversary this year. And we have had a long association with special rapporteurs, in particular the Special Rapporteur on Internally Displaced Persons was housed as a partner with us where we provided the research support for that mandate. That's one example in which organizations can support the mandates because they don't have resources. And then I got to Brookings having worked on the debate around the creation of the Human Rights Council, where it was a real priority for the international human rights community to preserve the independence of the special rapporteurs. And that was successful, but I decided to investigate further why special rapporteurs do their work, how they're effective on the ground, and did a lot of research around the world, really getting into the nitty-gritty about where these special rapporteurs meet national realities, and learned a lot. That's all in a book that I wrote called Catalyst for Change, if you're interested in really getting into the details, but I'm going to be drawing from that research. Two very quick comments, because I didn't want to lose the opportunity in response to Leilani's excellent presentation. As you could tell from her presentation, special procedures are more than the position. They are individuals and personalities with very strong commitment to what they're working on, to their mandates, very courageous in what they do, and have really made a difference in some very specific ways. I would also point out that in terms of norm development, special rapporteurs do at times get a mandate from the Human Rights Council to work on norm development. It's not always the case, but particularly if there's a new area of a topic that the Council wants to address, then the mandate is more focused on norm development and less on some of the operational aspects. And maybe we'll get to resources as well, because I think that's I have some ideas for how you could mobilize on that issue. Drawing just now on Madeleine's last slides about comparing with treaty bodies to put it in the universe of other mechanisms, there are a couple of points I want to highlight. One is that the special rapporteurs draw from all aspects of human rights law, not just the relevant treaty, right? The treaty body is limited to that treaty. They can also examine any UN member state, not just those states that have ratified that treaty. So that's another big advantage. They can make in situ country visits, which is not the case generally with treaty bodies. And they can receive and act on individual complaints without first exhausting domestic remedies, which is also very important in certain situations. So just to give you a quick comparison of why special rapporteurs are a more flexible tool in the toolbox of options. Now, how to think about effectiveness and impact. I'm doing this more in the context of a global comparison and not so much about the United States, but certainly there's relevance to how it works in the United States. But rapporteurs, as you could hear from Leilani, have so many demands on them that they have to pretty quickly prioritize where they're going to go. And I've advocated some kind of impact assessment before they, or as they're getting into their mandate, because it's impossible to address all the concerns, and looking at the factors where you could have the most impact. And one of those factors is the timing of the intervention. You know, states are in many different places in their own historical development and evolution toward human rights. And so I have found in my research that those states that are in some period of transition or change in leadership, where there are some reformers in government that are more engaged constructively with the UN system, and in many cases are inviting the pressure internationally because they need help to push an issue through their own bureaucracy, and often that's the international community, and in particular the United Nations, with the blue flag arriving in the country and getting the kind of attention and opening doors with many different actors that can make a difference. So the constructive engagement of relevant actors, not just the government officials and certainly not just the polite diplomats, but those that are actually making key decisions on whatever issue you're working on, is really critical. And of course, in the United States, in a federal system, you've got to drill down into the state and local level, why it's so important to be addressing directly with mayors, depending on what the issue is. Another factor is to what extent the UN is really at the table and seen as a credible actor. In this country, that's not always the case. There are different views about the United Nations. In general, public opinion surveys of Americans show a high positive opinion toward the United Nations, but politically, that is certainly not always the case. And we have a sector of our society that harken back to some fantasy about black helicopters, and sometimes that can get in the way. But in most countries, the UN is seen as a credible actor. And in most countries, you have UN local staff, country teams from UN Development Program, other actors who can play a supportive role. Sometimes special rapporteurs like to keep them at arm's length because of their independence, and they don't want to be seen as and somehow a UN employee, because they're really not speaking as a UN employee. They're working pro bono. They do not get paid. And so it's very important that they speak truth to power. But in other cases, it's important to bring the local UN actors in the mix if you want to have some, number one, on-the-ground intelligence, and number two, some support for implementation and follow-up after your visit. So that's a critical role. And I would say on that point of follow-up is another key factor for effectiveness, because the rapporteurs are in such high demand, it's very difficult for them to follow through. It sounds like, Leilani, you're an exception on that, because in general, it's just very hard to do the kind of follow-up work. So what you need is, in thinking about your country visit, and CSOs need to be thinking about this, how to create a pre-visit, an actual visit, and a post-visit strategy that carries forth. Because what you're going to get is a report from the mandate holder with a set of analysis and recommendations. And you can use those recommendations then to build an advocacy, litigation strategy, whatever it is. And I've seen in many cases around the world where that has been very, very effective. But in cases where there was no follow-through, it's really hard for the rapporteur to do it him or herself. Some rapporteurs have been able to do follow-up country visits or working visits, but that's few and far between because the resources. They really only have time and support to do 2 or 3 country visits a year. Another factor is the quality and the specificity of the special rapporteur's work. And there is a range that we see in the rapporteur's work product. And here, I think advocates can be very helpful in providing the suggestions for what would be the most kind of smart, measurable, actionable recommendations that can be used in the follow-up effort. 2 other factors to mention. One is the role of local NGOs. Obviously, I've already alluded to that, but it can really spell the difference. So when you're looking at where to operate, if you're operating in a space where there's very little civil society activism around a particular issue, it's going to be really hard for the special rapporteur to have impact, because as we said, there's no staff support. There's your part-time people here and there, a lot of turnover of staff in Geneva. It's just you really do need the local actors, which gives local actors a huge advantage in pushing an issue through. And then finally, a key factor is media. And the value of, if you're working in a country where there really is a robust media, to use it to your advantage, because when a UN official speaks, even if it's an independent, nonetheless, you still have the title of UN independent expert. You do get attention, and often when it's done in conjunction with another rapporteur, or 3 or 4, even more impact. And so the combination of showing up, it's fine to do a press release from Geneva, and that's really important because sometimes that's the only way you can do it, but also showing up in country and doing the press conference. In fact, it's mandated in the rules about how to do it. You've got to give the government officials a kind of pre-brief before you go public. but then you really do have an opportunity to give your best recommendations when the cameras are on, and that can make a big difference in creating kind of pressure on states to move. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Ted. I think that was really helpful in laying out both what are the procedures and what are the why do we want to use them. They're bold, innovative, flexible. They can bring media, but there's challenges in follow-up and resources and the work product. And so it'd be great to now hear from Rob to talk about what did that look like in your work in the United States around access to housing.
So I'll talk about it in a couple of contexts. I think folks know I have a relationship with UN Rapporteurs on the right to adequate housing. We had an official mission here in 2009 with Raquel Rolnick, but that relationship continues with Leilani Farha, and it also with Malloon Authority. All three happened to be here last October, and I wasn't in the city, and Malloon is still kind of angry at me that I didn't sit down and have lunch and come to the new school and engage with folks, so I'm feeling his wrath. But I want to thank, first of all, before I go into my presentation, Risa and Columbia Law School for inviting me. There are many folks in this room who have supported the work that I do and the work in the community, so it's an opportunity to say thank you to all of you. And some of you I'll point out around this particular work. So as we talk about UN procedures and mechanisms, I put it in these four categories, the way we think of it on the ground. So there are the treaty bodies. The U.S. has signed off on a few treaty bodies. There are special procedures. There are working groups of experts, and there are UN rapporteurs. I served the International Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. The U.S. last had an appearance before the Human Rights Council in August 2014. There's ICCPR, which is the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and the U.S. was last before the Human Rights Commission in March of 2014. It was ratified in 1992. Universal Periodic Review is interesting. That came about in I think 2009 for the U.S. The first appearance was in 2010. And there are folks in this room that sort of brought me to Geneva, and I'm going to call out right now Joanne Kamoff-Ward, Josh Cooper, and Eric Tars as three people that were instrumental in bringing me to understand how the voice of community needed to be heard directly before the Human Rights Council in Geneva. So it was those individuals that said, you have a story to tell about what's happening in the U.S. It shouldn't be us. It should be you and people like you who are directly affected. And they would basically say, there is the Consul General from Mexico. Go there and tell them the story. So it was very powerful for somebody who came from the community to be able to share stories of what was happening. And it is, a description of the process is here. We last went before that body again in May of 2015. The working group of experts. We recently had a UN working group of experts of people of African descent in January 2016. They were here in New York City. It was very powerful again for people. We had a little bit of a town hall meeting at the CUNY Grad Center where we brought in people from around the city that were directly affected by issues, particularly in the African American community. So whether it be issues of solitary confinement in prisons, a number of people being in prison, they got to share their stories with people from the UN. They get their story outside of the U.S. because they felt they weren't being heard. It's very powerful, as Leilani said, when those folks can speak directly to issues that are affecting them, but their government isn't listening. To tell an expert from someplace else and get this into the international community really raises up the issues. We had a UN working group on the issue of discrimination against women in law and in practice. They visited the U.S. November 30th through December 11th. We usually get the U.S. Human Rights Network coordinating these visits and really bringing people from the community to speak before these folks. You'll hear later on as we close out this today that Ajim Dike, the director of the U.S. Human Rights Network, will speak on behalf of how we recruit people from around the city and the country to engage and to share their stories. UN Special Rapporteurs is, again, folks know that's the space that I know the best. I've been brought into this, and the very first time was Ajim Dike. Before she worked for the network, used to work for the Urban Justice Center here in New York, and I was a member of Picture the Homeless, had just come out of homelessness and become a community organizer. She calls me one day, Picture the Homeless has said, Dodo Dien, the rapporteur on racism and racial discrimination, is coming to New York. He doesn't want to go to the UN. He wants to hear directly from communities. Rob organized a town hall meeting, and she hung up the phone. I was like, holy crap, what am I supposed to do, right? But it was a way of empowering the voice of people directly affected, and I'm so appreciative of it now, thinking back to that time. I was scared to death at the time, but it turned out very well, and he was just overjoyed by what he heard and able to react and hear people's problems. That mandate is currently held by Mutumalo Repair. Magdalena Sepulveda was a rapporteur on extreme poverty who Risa introduced me to in an event at Columbia, I believe it was in 2011, and it was an incredible thing. I got there early and I got to have a conversation with her and talk about the visit of Raquel, but I also got to talk about a problem with homelessness in Hungary, right? I had gone to Hungary as a member of Picture the Homeless in 2009, and through that conversation, she reached out to Raquel, and they wrote a strongly worded letter to the Hungarian government challenging their position on homelessness. The folks in Budapest were writing me emails and saying, what did you do? How did this happen? So it's very powerful, right, when you connect to these mechanisms and are able to share this with communities, not only in your own country, but around the world. It was pretty powerful to lift up the voices, and that mandate is currently held by Philip Austin, as you heard Leilani mention earlier. The rapporteurs on housing, there are the big three. Supporting work like myself and other communities, it's been very powerful and moving for us. In Detroit in 2014, every year I go out to Allied Media Conference. It happens in June. I just came back from Detroit and will leave this afternoon to go back to Detroit because it's the 50th anniversary of National Welfare Rights. But in 2014 in June, I went out to Detroit, and I always go to Allied Media, and then I spend a day volunteering at Michigan Welfare Rights. And we went out to dinner afterwards, and they took this documentary, which we did upon Raquel's visit, and they dropped it on the table and said to me, Bob, how can we do something like that in Detroit? And I was stunned. And I said, well, let's write a letter to the High Commissioner's Office of Human Rights. In the meantime, I came away. I had met Leilani in 2013 at a conference at Osgood Law School at the University of Toronto. So I said, well, I kind of know Leilani. Let me write an email to her also. And this fantastic visit came about, very powerful and moving, that happened in Detroit. We looked at national and elected officials were not responsive to the Detroit community, so we said we had to bring this to a broader community. We were struggling with massive water shutoffs, homeowners at risk of losing their homes in auction because if you couldn't afford to pay for the water, they made it a payment plan that they put onto your mortgage, and if you fell behind there, then you stood the risk of losing your home at auction. People were being threatened with felonies. Many people in Detroit were turning back on the water once it was turned off. They figured out how to do it, right? We need water to survive, right? Water is a human right. Katerina de Albuquerque, who was then the rapporteur on water, she is now, that mandate is over. And Leilani Farha, we're hearing testimonies and complaints in a lawsuit filed by some lawyers in Michigan. One of the people that testified at this Saturday afternoon of hearing these complaints was Nicole Cannon. I don't know if Leilani remembers, but it was a woman who had lung disease. Nicole Cannon has since passed away, but I think it was very powerful for Leilani and Katerina to hear the stories of people like Nicole, who had 3 daughters, who she would tell the story, my daughters love rice and beans, but I can't cook because I'm on a fixed income and I have to buy 3.5 gallons of water because I don't have any water coming into my house, and we have to ration the water that we use in the house. And you could see Leilani and Katerina's faces just cringe as those stories were being told. We had a huge town hall meeting where about 350 people showed up, talked about how water bills were being charged. There was one woman who lived near a pipe that was leaking. She was in an apartment and she was getting a bill for $1,000 a month. The only reason why she was being charged that, because her apartment was closest to the leak. Nobody would investigate why the leak was happening, but they just put it on that particular homeowner, and they wouldn't back down, right? It was just incredible. They met with residents directly. We put them on a bus, took them around Detroit, and they heard directly from homeowners who had no water in their home, who were struggling. And you know, one of the good things that happened, there were groups in Canada were forming coalitions to bring down water to Detroit. But it was just egregious that in the wealthiest country in the world, people were struggling around issues like that. And then the very popular news conference. It was incredible. Mayor Mike Dugan tried his best to get Leilani and Katerina to come to his office and do a news conference, and they set up their own news conference in a hotel, and it was very powerful, as Leilani said. Many members of the media turned out, including Al Jazeera, who quoted Mayor Mike Dugan, who said, Michigan Welfare Rights Organization went to great lengths to bring their friends from New York City and the UN and the international community to shame Detroit. And you know what? I recently said to him as I was out in Detroit, yeah, we did that because Detroit wouldn't listen, the U.S. wouldn't listen, but we knew we had ears out in the international community. So it's very powerful and motivating. So I would like to thank Leilani Farha and Katerina de Albuquerque for that visit. The folks in Detroit have charged me today with asking her to come back. I understand it's a challenge, but I did have conversations with Leilani, and I'm sure we'll continue to talk about it. But that was one of the most powerful visits that I've been involved in, and the folks in Detroit still remember every minute of that and feel empowered behind that process. So thank you, Leilani, and thank all of you.
Thanks so much, Rob. That was really great to hear how the mandate comes to life. So I think we have a little bit of time for questions for the panelists. So I'll open it up for a few. Start with Eric here and see if anyone else wants to jump in.
So I just wanted to talk a little bit more with Rob about the mission visit, and I think the Rapporteur visit back in 2009 really set a new standard for how the Rapporteur visits were looked at and could be done. And so I just wanted to give you a chance to explain a little bit more about the organizing around that and how regardless of whether the policies on the ground changed, we used that visit and the organizing for a visit to build the movement.
So I thank you, Eric, and I think it was about empowerment, right? That's what that visit was all about. But at the same time, it sort of set a standard, right? I wasn't afraid to reach out to other rapporteurs when they visit to say, this is what we did with Raquel. We have this documentary, and they found it very powerful. Just to explain a little bit of the process, Eric works for the National Law Center on Homelessness and Poverty. They organized the elected official and appointed official side of the visit, and Nesri, the organization that I volunteer at, organized the civil society portion. I happened to be in the Nesri office one day coming from Picture the Homeless, and Cathy Albisa, she was here earlier, and Tiffany Gardner, who was here for a while, basically called me into the office and said, well, this UN rapporteur is coming here. You know all these other groups, they're going to go to these cities. Get on the phone and organize it, much like Asian did, and they walked away. We're over here if you need us. So we got together and we just planned how this visit would look. We reached out to the different cities. So she went to LA, Chicago, New Orleans, Pine Ridge, South Dakota. She was supposed to go to Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, couldn't go. New Orleans, D.C., and New York. And, just working with groups around the country, we tried to make the visit look the same in every city to show the same things and the patterns that were happening. But the biggest part of that for us was the exceptionalism that the U.S. government showed with respect to human rights, right? We don't have human rights violations here, according to our government. They will point their fingers at other countries around the world. But folks like us who are directly affected would say, well, how come we have 1/3 the population of China, but we have more people in prison than China? So, there are all these contradictions that existed here. So it was a time to empower folks and to lift up the struggles of communities. And, we worked hard just to make all these cities look alike as we did this visit traveling around the country.
Great. Risa. And maybe we'll take a question from Risa and then from Leilani and let them. Okay, and then someone in the very back, and I think that may be all the time we have.
Yes, great. Okay, so thank you very much. Leilani has made a very compelling case for the need for more resources. Ted, you kind of teased us at the beginning that you had some ideas, so I don't want to let you leave before sharing some ideas about how we might maximize some resources for special rapporteurs.
Give up the secrets.
Let's take Leilani and then the question in the back first.
Thanks. This is a maybe odd question for Rob. I reiterate Risa's question to you, Ted. You know I would be interested, desperate and interested. But Rob, this is an odd question. But I noticed in the water shutoff campaign that some celebrities were engaged. Mark Ruffalo was one. I think there were some others. And I'm interested to know what you think about that. Is it useful? Do they fly in and leave? I think Mark has remained somewhat committed. I follow him on Twitter and so. But I'm just interested in that. I myself have thought about trying to go the route of harnessing one of these big megastars to support the right to housing. Some of them have lived in squalor and have been homeless themselves. A lot of actors, obviously, have had that reality. So just if you had any reflections on that.
Hi, Colin Bailey. I think we're all thinking the same thing. Risa asked my primary question. The second question was also from Ted's comments. I'm curious if, Ted, you or any of the other panelists have any particularly good examples of how the special rapporteurs have integrated with a litigation strategy.
Okay, should we start? Ted, you want to start and then?
Sure, thanks. On the resources, without getting too mired in the weeds on this, the budget from the United Nations from its regular budget that's devoted to human rights is 3%. So 3% of the UN's regular budget is devoted to human rights. Human rights is one of the three main pillars of the United Nations alongside security and development, and it gets 3% of the UN regular budget. It's a joke. I mean, we're just doing it on the cheap. It's not serious. So one of the reasons the UN Special Rapporteurs are scrambling to have any impact is because they're starved of resources intentionally, is my view. I mean, that's what. So that's got to change. Now, there are voluntary contributions that are made by individual states. Some of them are earmarked and some of them are not. So if a particular country, a donor country, wants to support a particular mandate, they make this voluntary contribution into the OHCHR in Geneva, and that mandate gets a lot more support as a result. And we have examples of that you mentioned. So one thing to do is to identify some sympathetic donor countries and to try to get them to make these voluntary contributions that are earmarked to a specific mandate. There's a political pushback against earmarks because what happens is this unequal distribution of resources, and other mandate holders say, wait a second, we don't have that, that's not fair. And often it falls along north-south lines. Rapporteurs who do not maybe have the networks within either the foundation community or with certain donor states are left with very fewer resources. So there is that dynamic. Now there's yet another possible angle here, which is here in New York at the UN Fifth Committee, which controls the budget, there could be a much more targeted campaign to get those member states on that committee to start ponying up more money toward human rights and at least aim for, say, a doubling of the contribution from the regular budget from 3% to 6%. You know, we've just reached the 10-year anniversary of the Human Rights Council. It's exploded in terms of its workload. The Universal Periodic Review was mentioned. We're not getting into that, but there's a year-round intensive amount of work that goes on human rights at the UN, and the resources have not grown to match that demand. So there needs to be work. In terms of what has to happen in the United States, in Washington, this is a political football. As I mentioned before, there are certain factions that are against any support to the UN, particularly on human rights, and they complain bitterly about a certain bias at the Human Rights Council against Israel. And there have been riders in U.S. legislation that require the United States to certify that it is doing all it can to remove the permanent item against Israel on the Human Rights Council agenda. It's very hard to do, and it's unlikely to succeed. And so that debate continues. I testified on the Hill recently, and I think the issue is actually shifting away from that conditionality, but it continues to be a problem. But we have work to do on the lobbying front for resources in Washington as well as here in New York. I'm sorry, on litigation strategies, I don't have an immediate example that comes to mind, but I can follow up with you and think that through. Maybe others do.
I just want to add something very quickly on the resources question, because I think everything that Ted said is absolutely correct. But there has been no, concerted civil society campaign on this. We've actually toyed with the idea a lot every 2 years, in fact, when the budget comes up in the Fifth Committee. And so I am kind of curious, in terms of reactions from civil society groups in the room, whether that's something that people would be interested, because there are two sort of main political groups that would need to be sort of targeted. One is the donor countries, of which the U.S. is obviously a major one. If civil society in the U.S. Was to speak up a little bit, more and loudly and together around this, that might help. And the other is, unfortunately, another group of countries, the G77, so a very large group of so-called developing countries, because there are actually countries at various stages of development now in that group. They actually sort of control the budget committee. So it would need to be, I think, a very sort of large, worldwide sort of civil society campaign. But the fact that it is 3% and it's remained around 3% for a long time is really shameful. But it has been in the context of these budget cuts every year. So every 2 years, I should say, there have been requirements to actually cut the UN budget since the financial crisis. So yeah, I would be really interested, because we've never done like a real sort of survey of advocates to see what the appetite would be for a really big campaign. But it is a sort of situation of crisis at this point.
So I'll speak briefly to the finance issue, and then I want to answer Leilani's question. I've been very much involved in the Habitat 3 process this year, and I think that's an incredible amount of wasted resource not going to any good use. It's being put towards a new urban agenda, which is a top-down model, doesn't involve people directly affected. I got in there only because myself and a professor from the New School challenged Housing and Urban Development's initial report into that process for Habitat 3. So folks got excited with the way that we challenged it. But I'm watching resources just be poured in a hole where they could go to better use. So maybe I would love to talk to the folks here about how to better use those resources and how we can agitate and force it in a different direction. But with respect to celebrity, I think there were good and there were bad, Leilani. With respect to housing, Michael Moore worked with us at Take Back the Land. His movie, Capitalism, A Love Story, featured the Trody family, a family that was evicted in Florida and lived in a bread truck over the weekend. And it was that initial confrontation in Miami where Max Ramo and Take Back the Land were moving them back into a house, and Michael Moore came with the film crew and a boom mic and decided to put it in that movie. And then when we did subsequent actions, he would finance a lot of those actions with having us signs made up. He would always be out there with food for the folks. So I think there were folks sympathetic. I think we have to pick and choose our battles. Ruffalo is good on the water stuff, but there are some that just use it to lift their own situation and make themselves look good. So I think we have to pick and choose who we want. I'm also on the board of Left Forum, so there are some folks that we get on those plenaries at Left Forum that I think we could have some good, useful conversations with. So,
great, thanks. And just before we close, with regard to the litigation question, because the Center for Reproductive Rights does a lot of litigation around the world, and we always integrate a special rapporteur
special mandate strategy within that, both in terms of before the litigation, in developing standards that we'd like to see set by the court in the case that we're litigating, but also in implementation of judgments. And I'm happy to talk to you afterwards about more specifically what that means, because I think at this point we're out of time. So I'd just like to thank the panelists and everyone in close.
Yeah, if you could, just put the table next to the other.
I mean, the right overview is helpful, right? That's right. Oh my gosh, no, maybe some water would be useful, just in case.
Practice. Yeah. Okay. Okay, so for these. So we work on
they heard it the right way. Thank you so much, right? So, but it's more of oh my God.
Hello, how are you?
How are you?
Justin.
I'm Amanda.
Nice to meet you.
Hi, nice to meet you.
All right. Where are you from again, Amanda?
The State Department.
State Department, yes. Okay. Yes. UNSP. Yep. UNSP, that's it. And there it is. And so the second one, there's a web link. I click on the web link, and then I have to go and click on video to get it to open. So there's a second step. It's a web page that we could pull it up now and get it prepped if that's helpful. Okay. How do I do that?
I'm not really feeling the draft back there. It's perfect. Right.
I am so sorry that I keep
Keep interrupting June's conversations. I'll let her talk for one more minute.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, it's time to get started. Do you want me to get folks their seats? So if folks would kindly take their seats, we're going to get started. Thank you. really crowded. So, is there enough room for everyone?
Thea, nice to meet you. I was hoping I could meet you too. Great. I'm looking forward to the conversation. Amal is right. He was just right here. I've seen him. I'll let you know. Have you met him already? That's okay.
That's how it's such a great format.
Hi, I'm Thea.
Yeah.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too.
Hi,
Amanda.
We've met before, Zach.
It's possible.
Yeah.
It's possible. Yes.
Oh.
Unless you're thinking of Amanda Wall, who's my legal counterpart.
No, but I feel like I met you and your name is familiar.
We would have attended the sort of UPR consultations that are ongoing at State Department. We'll figure it out.
How have you been?
Good. How have you been?
Been busy?
Yeah,
Good.
it seems like.
Yeah. It's been a while since you guys have been by the office, huh?
I know. I try not. I don't know.
You try to avoid it.
You know, my experience with New York is always like getting into Penn Station in DC or in Union Station in DC, calm, quiet, and then getting out at Penn Station here.
Shit show.
So it just it tarnished my love of New York a bit.
Penn Station is the worst entry point into New York, and it has such bad energy. Don't you agree? Yeah, worst part of the city.
I don't actually know how to navigate it, so it's going to take me. I'm budgeting like 20, 30 minutes to sort of figure out where I need to be. I'm going to have to probably ask somebody and be very embarrassed about it.
You might, although most of the entrances will point you directly to the trains,
right?
And then you don't go straight to the track. You go to the main hall before boarding time, so give yourself 20 minutes or so, and then there's a big board up there, and maybe 10 minutes before boarding, it'll tell you which track it's going to board on, and then there's like a rush.
It's like we're all sprinting toward our gate that's a mile and a half away.
Yeah. No, it's not that far though, at least. And the minute that they put up there, say stand by, and then it'll say the track, and then there's like a whole rush of people, and it's a little chaotic, but you just kind of funnel into the.
Okay.
Not too bad. But I would definitely leave 20 minutes just so you're not feeling stressed about it.
Yeah.
You'll be fine.
Yes.
Still listed in this order, but it's not the order that was
in the outline?
In my last.
No. So Justin, Dina,
Oh, sorry. We're catching up.
Hi,
I'm Justin. Yes.
Hi, I'm Thea.
Thea, nice meeting you.
Nice to meet
All
you.
right. Hi, how are you doing? Good seeing you again. All right.
But this one isn't wearing his name tag.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, I'm back. Justin, how are you?
I have this here.
Yeah, we just
She's
met.
explaining the ordering here.
Okay.
Okay, am I supposed to start? Hello, everybody. Our panel is the only thing standing between you all and lunch. So, anyway, okay. Hi, I'm June Zeitlin. I'm the Director of Human Rights Policy at the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. For those of you who don't know us, we're a coalition of over 200 national organizations based in Washington, D.C., that have been working on civil rights legislation and advocacy at the national level since the 1960s. In 2009, actually, we changed our name to be the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, so that our work here in the United States would be more formally connected to the human rights movements around the world. And we have been active in doing shadow reports and presenting in Geneva when the U.S. is reviewed on the treaties that it has ratified, and the Universal Periodic Review, and also helping to organize consultations in Washington with UN working groups that have visited, the two that were just mentioned that came last year and this year, the Working Group on Discrimination Against Women and the Expert Group on People of African Descent. So we see a lot of connections between our civil rights advocacy and our human rights advocacy, and we work particularly on holding the United States accountable for its human rights obligations, and work with many of the groups in this room, particularly the U.S. Human Rights Network, Columbia Center for Reproductive Rights, all of these people who are here. So I want to thank Risa and Joanne for organizing this, and get to our panel, which is large but very distinguished. So we're not going to be making formal presentations or PowerPoints. We're going to try to do this as a discussion. And so I'm going to be holding people to limit their responses so that we have time for discussion amongst ourselves, but then some discussion with all of you, because that's really important. And there's obviously a logic to this agenda. And so you've gotten a lot of background, and you've also gotten a sense of how these procedures can be used from the point of view of a special rapporteur. And what we're going to talk about here is how these different experts and representatives of civil society are using the special procedures, how it's worked well, what can be improved. And we also have a representative from the State Department who will talk about the use of special procedures from the government perspective, but also how government and civil society can interact most effectively. So I'm just going to very briefly introduce our panelists. Their bios are all in your packet, and they make excellent reading. The first three speakers that I'm going to introduce are individuals who have had experience interacting with special procedures about situations here in the United States. And then we're going to hear from Amanda from the State Department, and then we're going to go to Thea, whose experience is working on issues relating to the special procedures, but globally. So that's kind of the logic of our presentations. So the first speaker will be Justin Hanford. Justin is a law professor at the University of St. Louis. And for those of you who aren't so familiar with Missouri's geography, they're very close to Ferguson. So he's going to talk about all of the incredible work he's been doing relating to Ferguson and racial justice with the special procedures. The second speaker is going to be Dina Hurwitz. And Dina is also a human rights law professor doing both clinical work and academic work. And she has worked in particular with the UN Special Rapporteur for Violence Against Women. And so she's going to talk about the work that they've done in that interaction. She's also worked with the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous People. So I hope she'll have time to at least touch on both of those. And then our third speaker will be Amal Mehra. And Amal is the director of the International Corporate Accountability Roundtable, and he's really an expert and done a lot of extensive work on business and human rights. Our fourth speaker will be Amanda Jessen. Amanda's a foreign affairs office in the Bureau of International Organizations at the State Department in Washington. She actually has not been with the State Department for many, many, many years. She actually has experience working in civil society and working particularly on issues relating to women, violence, and extremism. But in her role at the State Department, she's one of the key contact points for arranging visits of special mandate holders and also interacting with many of us in civil society. So finally, Thea is going to wrap it up in terms of the initial presentations, and she's with ESCR-Net. She coordinates their group relating to human rights defenders and urgent appeals. So she's going to talk about the work that she's been doing globally in terms of special procedures. So I only stood up because there's so many of us, but I'm going to ask Justin to start to talk about, as I said, his experiences with the special procedures, and in particular, his work with Ferguson led him to present and report to the Committee Against Torture, when the U.S. was presenting, but also he's played an active role with the UN Working Group of Experts on People of African Descent, and there are probably others as well, but I'm going to turn it over to Justin.
All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you, June, for the invitation and the introduction. The first thing I'm going to do is to directly contradict you. I'm going to actually have a PowerPoint, so sorry to rain on the parade, but it's going to be a small one. So I was someone who lived in St. Louis when Ferguson happened, and all of my involvement with the UN special procedures happened in the moment, literally while things were exploding around us in the aftermath of the initial protests all the way until the non-indictment decision. So what I want to do is to tell you a little bit about that story within 4 to 5 minutes and explain the role that the UN special procedures played and how I think they can be more helpful in the future. So one of the things that we had an opportunity to do, along with Meena Jagannath, Nicole Lee, and some other human rights activists, was to try to take the movement and internationalize the movement by creating an intervention that we called Ferguson to Geneva. We started a website. We were able to fundraise about $10,000 in a few weeks so that we could do a submission to the United Nations Convention Against Torture and go to present in Geneva during the treaty review in November of 2014. When we did that, as you can see, we were very active and we were involved in protests as well as participation with local activists as well as the family of Mike Brown. This is me with Mike Brown's mother, who presented her testimony before the UN Convention Against Torture. As you know, she had to experience being in Ferguson, seeing her son's dead body laying on the street for over 4 hours, and she was someone who had to stand there in the hot sun and just witness that. And so she told her story, and people listened there who were from all over the world. And to me, it was one of the most important experiences in my life to be able to work with her as an attorney, helping her prepare her testimony. And she felt that this was one of the experiences where she got to tell her own story and reclaim her own dignity. So this was a situation where I feel that the UN did allow Mike Brown's mother to have a role in reclaiming the narrative and tell it from her own perspective. But in the aftermath, we reached out to special rapporteurs. Of course, Juan Mendez, the special rapporteur on torture, was particularly interested in what we had done because he was there when Mike Brown's mother gave her presentation. We also reached out to other rapporteurs, and we did this on the 21st of November. Little did we know that 3 days later, the decision would come out that Mike Brown's killer, Darren Wilson, would not be indicted. And as you know, things got out of hand very soon thereafter. So we sent these special procedure letters as more of a cry for help than your regular communication where you're hoping to start a long-term process of interaction. A couple of the special rapporteurs responded to us immediately. Some responded to us a few weeks later. One thing that happened was there was a press statement that went out in the days after denouncing what had happened. But one thing that we know for sure was that nobody was killed in the aftermath of the non-indictment. And one of the main things that we said in our letters to the special rapporteur, which we put online, was that we wanted the police to measure their response so that there wouldn't be any loss of life. And if there was, it was going to be a clear human rights violation. And so we feel that when we went to the United Nations and brought attention to the issue, and the special rapporteurs brought attention to the issue with their statements to the press, in some way we affected that response. And indeed, FOIA requests later revealed that the governor, Jay Nixon, had directed the police to value people over property this time because they didn't want this sort of negative attention, even internationally. So we know there was an effect. So I'm going to go really quickly through the rest of these slides. We used the UN and the special procedures statements and their positions on the fact that these were human rights violations in many different venues. When we spoke to the public, we brought the UN up in the discussion in social media with my friends DeRay and Netta. We emphasized to them to mention that this was a human rights issue, not just a civil rights issue. In academia, in the media, when we testified before the Missouri legislature for reform, we brought up the UN in front of the Ferguson Commission and the U.S. Civil Rights Commission. I testified before the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing, and I cited these statements by the UN Special Rapporteurs. I involved myself in civil disobedience here, and it's clearly a case where I thought that I was going to be just an observer. As you see, I have my National Lawyers Guild observer hat on, and you see how much good that did me in my efforts to be an observer. But this was a case where I was arrested, and other human rights activists who also went to the United Nations with me were arrested, Tef Poe and Tara Thompson. Funny thing, we were charged with trespass, given 2 years, or the plea deal was for 2 years probation and a lifetime ban from, this was in a Walmart where we did this protest. So we were given the charge of a lifetime ban from all Walmarts all across the country as a result of this protest. And we often said we didn't know if that was meant to be a reward or a punishment. But even then, it was very important to us to be able to say that we were human rights activists. We weren't just some rabble-rousers. We had statements from the UN, the United Nations in Geneva, saying that what was happening was a violation of our human rights. And that gave us a lot of moral support and a lot of encouragement to be able to make that statement. So, you know, as we continue to advocate before the Inter-American Commission and in other places, we look to the special procedures to play a role in the movement for Black lives. And there are a number of ways they can continue to do so, and I look forward to discussing those with you further in the time we have together. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Justin. You set a good example in terms of time, as well as the content, which I think people really got a sense of the dynamic and energy that went into this work. The next speaker is going to be Dina, and if you want to go up, yeah, that's okay.
Well, I want to also thank the organizers, Risa, and the Human Rights Institute for putting this together and for inviting me to be part of it. It's been a long time. Can people hear me? I feel like I heard you better than I can hear me when you're. it's been a while since I was actively involved with the UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women. Is this the one that works? Yeah. Oh, this one is not on. Leilani, when you got up here and you asked somebody else to do that, I just felt like I was in good company. But I still don't think this is on. Can you hear it in the back? Okay.
Make it a little, bring it a little closer.
This okay.
Here, do you want
That's perfect. Right. Thank you. Okay. No, it's not. Now it is. Thank you. At any rate, I worked for a number of years with the UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, Rashida Manjoo, who was, I think, the third Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women. The first was Radhika Kumaraswamy, and the second was Yakin Ertürk. And I had met Rashida as in my capacity teaching a human rights clinic. She came to Human Rights Clinicians Gathering when she was a fellow at the Harvard Human Rights Clinic. So I knew her, but I knew her in the context of the kind of clinical legal education work that we did. And when I found out that she had been appointed, I contacted her right away, and I said, knowing the resource restraints, I said, why don't you let my clinic be your unofficial secretariat? And it didn't take her long to say, sounds great. And what I had in mind was really knowing that it's just so hard for special rapporteurs to get around, to travel, to write and research. That was what I envisioned my clinic doing. So it was a great opportunity for my students, and it was a great opportunity for Rashida, I think. So one of the things I wanted to mention is that the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women's mandate, I don't know if it actually specifically says to develop norms, because somebody mentioned that is a specific part of some of their mandates, but the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women has been really great and proactive in developing particularly the norm of due diligence in the context of violence against women. And what's been neat is that Radhika Kumaraswamy started that to develop the standard. She just started to discuss the standard, and then Yakin Ertürk developed it further. And when Rashida came to the mandate, she really wanted to think about reconceptualizing due diligence and how to think of it in a proactive way. So what I mean by due diligence, for those of you who know the term, the buzzword, but it really is just the issue of or the matter in human rights, and in a whole lot of different areas of accountability, state accountability in human rights. And for the most part, due diligence analysis has tended to focus on responding to state acts after they've already occurred. So the question was, what kind of framework can be set up to work with states and encourage them to be proactive and to think about the respect, protect, fulfill before the remedy measures of due diligence. And with respect to violence against women, there was really no clear definition or practical guidance on due diligence with respect to violence against women per se, because the CEDAW actually doesn't directly address violence against women. Basically, the work that my clinic did was to start out working with her to do some research. Oh my gosh. That's because I spent too much time talking about that. Anyway, I will go really fast and just mention that the work that we did was to research due diligence in all sorts of contexts, in the context of corporations, corporate work, and to write a memo. And then we also, the big part of what we did was to prepare for an official visit of the Special Rapporteur to the United States. She had already put in a request for the visit. And so we organized an informal discussion among human rights advocates to how to approach the preparation for her visit. We did a survey to try to broaden the advocates that were involved in this issue, are involved in this issue beyond the human rights people and legal services that we knew. And we also put together, at her request, a briefing book. Ta-da! This was a big part of what we did, and we put together this briefing book outlining key issues, providing legal and practical context, questions or recommendations for her, so that when she came here, she had something besides her own intentions and her own notes and her own research to really refer to what advocates here were working on and were concerned about. Well, and then we also worked together to organize civil society, to think about where she could go in the United States besides the kind of beaten path, so that she could meet other communities who are working on these issues. So, for example, we got involved with the Indian Law Resource Center, and then she wound up going to a Native American community in, I think, Western North Carolina, where she was where they were focusing on gun violence against Native women, and an issue that is, I think many of you probably know, a really big problem and hasn't gotten the kind of public attention that other issues of violence against women have gotten. I'll stop there because I'm clearly over my time, but answer more. Thank you.
Sorry, I turned it off because I thought maybe that would affect the mic working. Okay, our next speaker is going to be Amal, and he's going to talk about his work on business and human rights.
And I may sit right here, if that's okay. I feel like I've found a sweet spot where there's not AC blowing on me directly. So I'm just going to stay right here. I also want to extend my thanks to the organizers for the invitation to this event. Risa and the work of Columbia Law, as well as this network, is remarkable, and we are pleased to be a part of such a vibrant group of human rights activists, lawyers, educators. So thank you for the invitation. So, I work on business and human rights issues, which I'm sure many of you in the room will agree have sort of boomed in recent years, both here in the U.S., but also very much so at the Human Rights Council. And I think this is for a number of factors, not least globalization, but also the lacking capacity of governments or will of governments to better regulate corporations. So I think because of these sort of contextual issues, we've seen the Human Rights Council start to increasingly, through different mandates, approach business and human rights issues. We've been the perhaps lucky, in some contexts, beneficiaries of some of that energy. We've worked on a number of mandates now with special procedures, including the Working Group on Business and Human Rights, the Special Rapporteur on Toxics, the Special Rapporteur on Modern Slavery, the Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food, who currently, or the past Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food, Olivier de Schutter, who we currently collaborate with, and current Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Association and Assembly, Mina Kiai. So it's been an interesting journey for us. What we've witnessed, and I'm sure many of you appreciate this too, absent the mandate holders currently in the room, there seems to be a widespread of expertise, engagement, and strategy behind the different mandates that we work with. We've noticed that sort of not all mandates are created the same, nor are all special procedures as equipped both personally and structurally to execute a broader human rights aim as others. So what we have done in our engagement is really assessed what we think that mandate and that SR or working group is capable of, and then based on that try to very much sort of capacitate or otherwise get in front of what they may be doing. So in some context, what we did was we researched, like Dina's example is similar to what we've done with some of the mandate holders, where there were capacity gaps around their own research, or their OHCHR staff corollary wasn't someone who had particular subject matter expertise in the topic of the mandate. That's very common, in fact. So the mandate holder and we engaged together, us providing research to that staffer or to the mandate holder directly, and working with them in that direct relationship. In some contexts, we organized where we noticed perhaps a country visit. What we did with the Working Group on Business and Human Rights is we actually organized the civil society inputs into the Working Group's country visit by convening our membership and also connecting the Working Group to key organizations around the country where we could really highlight the significance of business and human rights at the local, regional, and then national level. That led to the Working Group, for instance, meeting with the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, which are an organization that we support and believe in very much, but also other groups across the U.S. And finally, I think the other way, I mean, the session is titled Strategies for Effective Engagement. To be honest and perhaps controversial, some of the most effective engagements we've had is to not engage, or to rather understand where a particular set of working group members or a special rapporteur may, through engagement, not lead to a result that we want to see because of the political nature of their appointment process or the constituencies that they are serving. So, you know, I think I'm under time, but I'm hoping that we get more into that discussion as well, because I think, I think there's a lot here about effectively engaging and driving, but there's also a lot here about recognizing the limitations of the special mandate holders. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Amal, and thank you for raising some more controversial questions. So I think we will definitely get to that. So I've asked Amanda to go next because although I thought that in talking about work from a civil society perspective with the special procedures, there might have been more comments about the exchange and working with the government. But maybe everyone was being very polite. So, but actually there's a lot of exchange and working together, and so I thought it would be helpful before we go to a more global approach to have Amanda talk about, from her perspective, the work with the special procedures. So please.
Sure. So thanks to June. Thank you, Risa, for organizing this event and for having us. Thanks to you all for sitting here patiently while I talk to you about what the U.S. government does in terms of engagement with special procedures. And thanks also to the Special Rapporteur on Adequate Housing for that brief shout out. I think we agree that we do at least try very hard to be constructively engaging with you and with your colleagues. Because it's a huge policy imperative for us in terms of our domestic policy and in terms of our foreign policy as well. I don't know how we can really be credible if we are not showing up to this particular discussion. And so even in scenarios where the United States votes against certain resolutions that may create or renew a mandate, we strive to continue to be responsive to that mandate holder's requests for information or calls for input or even country visit requests. So again, the United States, I think, feels unequivocally that these are important institutions within the UN system, and we try very hard to constructively engage to the extent that we're able. I would say that we take seriously opportunities to push other countries to be responsive as well, because we think, again, these are effective mechanisms. And, we do have a strong policy commitment to continue that work. I've been asked to talk a bit about how exactly the United States engages with these special procedures, so I can go into some detail there. I'll give you some high-level overviews and would be very happy to answer additional questions as you might have them. But as your government's primary point of contact for incoming communications, I would say there are sort of two categories under which we might engage with these mandate holders, primarily, one of which is the many communications that we receive. Some of those communications are the specific inquiries that contain allegations of human rights violations. We take those very seriously, and we strive to respond to those at a 100% completion rate. It's not always possible, I suppose, in the long history of our engagement, but since I at least have joined the office, it has been my personal prerogative to do as best as I possibly can to marshal the process that we undertake to deliver substantive responses to these specific inquiries. they vary greatly. I can recall one where we were asked to comment on a 1920s study called the Rosenwald Fund study, in which descendants of participants alleged that they were experiencing adverse effects of mercury poisoning. And that was something I knew very little about, of course. But I think, that was an opportunity for me to reach out to an agency like the CDC that may not have any awareness at all about the United States involvement with special procedures and glean their expertise and deliver a substantive response that we hope was satisfactory. So that's sort of the specific inquiry tranche of work that I undertake. It can involve coordination only internal to the State Department. It can involve a great deal of interagency coordination. In some cases, we do need to reach out to local and state government officials because we simply cannot answer questions about what might occur in a town in Texas or somewhere in Washington state. So that is an opportunity for us to reaffirm our commitment to the special procedures to our state and local colleagues and to draw from their experience in this space and hear sort of the information they're able to provide, and we then work to transmit that information to the rapporteurs. But the second bucket, I think that might be very interesting as well to you all, is the country visit bucket. As several people have already mentioned, 2 visits have taken place in the past 6 months. There are at least 3 more scheduled for the rest of 2016, the first of which will kick off July 11th, and that's the Special Rapporteur on Freedoms of Association and Assembly. And for that particular exercise, I will say that it requires a great deal of work. In some cases, the work is sort of focused on explaining to the rest of our interagency why it's crucial that they show up to meetings with these rapporteurs. I can assure you, the EPA is wonderful to work with, but not always totally aware of why they should be involved in a country visit. And that's sort of my job, to have that conversation and to stay patient. But most of these trips, they take place in local and state areas totally outside of DC. So again, it's important to be in direct communication with state and local actors. I love showing up at events like these because I often get to meet actual humans who I can then direct inquiries to. I cannot tell you how happy I am when I come across an executive assistant to a mayor's office or to Commissioner Bratton, for example. That makes my job so much easier, and I find that actually most of these officials are really excited to be asked to participate in these sorts of visits because they're sort of unique, and I think it gives them an opportunity to showcase the best practices they may be very proud of, and hopefully to have honest conversations about areas that require improvement. So these country visits are excellent opportunities for us to engage directly with rapporteurs and working groups over a long period of time as compared to, let's say, a specific inquiry where, coordination may take several days or several weeks, but again, we get sort of sustained engagement with rapporteurs during the course of a country visit. So I will leave it at that for now. I'm happy to go into more detail on the modalities of how we engage in various ways with rapporteurs and working groups, and I thank you again for having me on the panel.
Thank you, Amanda. Now we're going to turn to Thea, and I hope you can give some examples of how other activists in other parts of the world are using the special procedures and what we might be able to learn from those experiences.
Thank you. To compress experiences from the rest of the world into a 5-minute talk is probably a tall order, although I very much appreciate the framing of the question. But I will say that I was asked in particular to speak about the communications aspect of working with special procedures. And a number of the principles that have come forward in the first conversations of the day around effective ways of engaging with these mechanisms have resonated with a lot of the experiences that I have had working with NGOs, social movements, and other types of human rights defenders around the world and engaging with this mechanism. So I'd like to just tease a few of those out in a little bit more detail, focusing on a particular case that ESCRnet has been involved with for several years, which is a case based in India, in the northeast of India, in a state called Orissa, where a large steel plant has been planned, established by the POSCO Corporation, which is a Korean-based steel manufacturer, a massive steel manufacturer. This project is slated to forcibly displace approximately 20,000 people from their land, people whose lives have depended on, their livelihoods have depended on the land from small farming, small fishing, and gathering activities. Since the MOU was signed with this company in 2005, a social movement had sprung up to really resist this forcible displacement that was going to take place as a result of the project. And they did engage ESCRnet to try to help support with their advocacy, in particular to engage with the special procedures mechanism. To cut the story really short, because it's a rich story and it's well documented elsewhere for those that are interested, pulling out just a few of the kind of principles of what I thought made for a very strategic engagement with the mechanisms of the special procedures. First of all, while there isn't, as previous speakers have pointed out, a requirement for exhausting domestic remedy before recurring to special procedures, politically in some contexts it seems to really make sense for advocates and defenders on the ground to try to exhaust at least political recourses before going to the international level. And one of the things we found here is that the groups that had really tried to use human rights arguments to defend their lands and their livelihoods did first tap into a wide range of domestic bodies, National Commission on the Protection of the Rights of the Child, the National Green Tribunal, which was able to weigh in on environmental impact, the SEC board, because it was a special economic zone. And, these are different kind of entities within the Indian system that really, I think, from the perspective of the receptiveness of public opinion in the Indian government to hear in the end the recommendations of special procedures, was important that there was first able to demonstrate there was effort to bring these points forward from within the domestic realm there. ESCRnet did end up coordinating a fact-finding mission around this project to try to help really ascertain and document what the human rights impacts would already had been and were going to be if the project were to go forward. And that has been pretty extensively documented. We do have a report online about that for those that are interested in seeing more. The long and the short of it is that there are very serious human rights concerns related to the issue of forced eviction that span a wide range of human rights issues: food, health, adequate housing, standard of living, and numbers of others, including in the civil and political rights realm. The result of this report and the kind of advocacy processes that had been galvanized around this fact-finding did lead to a series of engagements with special procedures. Communications were first issued around the really initial kind of concern around police brutality, basically, in repressing peaceful protests that had sprung up around this project. But after they kind of got more nuanced in the analysis about what the rights issues were, there were a series of communications that were issued from multiple mandate holders to the Indian government, but also to the POSCO Corporation itself about the human rights responsibilities that the communities on the ground were arguing corresponded to that company, in addition to the Korean government, which is where the home state of this transnational corporation was based. And in that regards, these, in each of these communications, of course, they were a little different in terms of highlighting what the particular obligations were. It was interesting to see the response. On the one hand, one would think that the Indian government is by far the most active part of that conversation. The Indian government was the one actor that actually refused to dignify the communications of the response, even after several follow-ups. On the other hand, the POSCO Corporation fed back with some very vigorous responses. I mean, they were kind of ludicrous from my perspective because they suggested that an internal voluntary code of conduct, I think it was called the happiness policy, was an adequate kind of, human rights approach, and that a sexual harassment hotline for their employees was adequate recourse for human rights impacts that might occur from their operations. Nonetheless, there was still an acknowledgement that the conversation with special procedures was actually legitimate and important. The Korean government also engaged in multiple rounds of communication with the mandate holders, particularly around the issue of to what extent does their legal system provide an adequate recourse for people whose rights are affected overseas from operations of their companies. And that is really, that dialogue and the engagement with special procedures arguably really did help consolidate emerging standards around the area of extraterritorial obligations, which, as several of you know, is really kind of a cutting-edge area of human rights standard setting and law and advocacy that's still not exhausted yet. Realizing my time's about up, I'll just say finally that there was a big press release that was issued by 8 mandate holders, actually, in October of 2013, after the confidential period had kind of ended around these communications. And that press release was incredibly useful in helping groups on the ground gain space, recognition, perceived legitimacy around the claims that they were putting forward. It helped them bring on board a number of allies that were more like campaigning organizations, bring in non-judicial recourse mechanisms of different types that seem to be very useful in pursuing the advocacy claims that they had. And at present, although I think it's difficult to talk about fully winning in any case like this, and even figuring out what the end point of that process is really tricky. But we are at this moment expecting any day now, I hope, an announcement from the company that this project will not go forward, which again just kind of leads to some reflection about perhaps some effective ways of engaging with the procedures, again, consistent with some of the remarks that we've heard in the earlier conversations. Thank you.
Thank you. So I think we've heard a number of different perspectives, but a number of also common ideas on the table in terms of when you decide to engage with a special procedure or maybe a human rights treaty body or a working group. And maybe we could talk a little bit more about what goes into that decision. And related to that is, what is your goal? Who is your target? Is it a company? Is it a country? Is it a sub-unit of government, a state and local government? Is it media attention? And maybe several of these. But I think it would be good if maybe we could address that question more specifically. What goes into making that initial decision? Because everybody up here, even the government, has limited resources and limited time. And so we can't do everything. How do we decide what would be most effective? So who wants to start? Justin?
Sure. Well, of course, for us, in the moment, we decided to try as many people as possible, and it really came down to who was responsive to us. And so as we reached out to a number of special procedures mechanisms, the UN Working Group for Afro-Descendants really became the group that gave us the most engaged response over a period of time. And so as we started to select targets, whether it was university, company, local government, it was an ongoing conversation which really had a lot to do with our ability to mobilize the community behind whether it's a country visit. So the working group came for a country visit in January, and we had a chance to engage them as well. And they came to Washington, D.C., and they went to New York. Whether it was a press release, whether it was, the communications are often classified, or they can't make the communications with the states public. So it was difficult for us to convey to the public, to our community, to our activists, what was happening in a specific way and how they could make that useful for the on-the-ground mobilization. So for me, just reflecting on it, if I was to sit down and have more time to have a deliberate decision as to how to engage, one of the main factors would be, of course, how does this play into the strategy on the ground? And how can this particular special procedure engage in a public way with this movement? So, for our movement, we've been able to find ways to speak at public forums that the UN Working Group has put together. Lisa Garza spoke at one here in New York. We've been able to create relationships with other aspects of the diaspora. So there's also the movement around reparations, which the working group was able to bring a great deal of attention to when they made their visit in January. And that is a movement that is, of course, not the same theme as the movement for Black Lives, but it is deeply connected in the underlying premise that we need to start to change the way we think about the value of Black life, the importance of creating opportunities for reconciliation. And so, this ability to put us into contact with other movements on related issues, those are the sort of factors that I would think about if I was to be more deliberate about the relationship in the future.
Sure. Thanks. For us, it comes down to whether there is an alignment in the strategy and the goals. So the mandate holders each come into, at least the ones we've interacted with, which have been many, come into their posts with a discrete sort of angle that they'd like to pursue in elaborating the mandate. And if we find that there is an alignment between our goals and objectives with what the mandate holder is particularly interested in pursuing, then we would engage and support the mandate. We often find, though, that that isn't the case necessarily. And the ways that we sort of determine where to put our resources are very much an open discussion with the holder of the mandate. So not to specifically point out, because I don't know if I should, but there have been instances where a mandate holder has a specific objective in mind to influence an ongoing process, let's say, at the UN, or to broaden perhaps the scope of the work that they could do by pushing the bounds of their own mandate. And there we'll support that if we feel like we can then use some of the conclusions or research used with the UN stamp on it for some of our own influencing strategies. But that often is not the case as well.
Thank you. Thea, go ahead. Not Thea, Dina. Sorry. You're Thea.
So the way that I approached getting involved with the special rapporteurs, and you mentioned the special rapporteur on Indigenous rights, my clinic had also done quite a bit of research with Jim Anaya when he was recently the special rapporteur on Indigenous peoples. Because of being in a law school, I was very interested in norm development. So when I said that I offered to be the secretariat, maybe that sounds like I offered to organize all of her tours or something like that. Basically, I was trying to find a way to bolster the work that Rashida Manjoo had prioritized in those normative ways. And so, for example, with Jim Anaya, we worked a lot with him. He was very, very active in moving the definition or the application of free, prior, and informed consent with respect to Native and Indigenous peoples' rights to land and the resources that are on them. Moving it from consultation to consent and making sure that was understood. And the other thing I just wanted to reiterate is, when you think about, at least with the issue of violence against women in the United States, it's a pretty known, there's a lot of people working on it. In fact, I forgot to mention that we worked with Katrina Anderson and other people from the Center for Reproductive Rights and ACLU, but we wanted to think about who do we not talk to? Who don't we know anything about? Who is working and is really on the ground? The grassroots, who don't participate in these national networks and obviously and don't think about human rights or the international framework. So I mentioned the Native American women. I was also really excited. I discovered this is in 2010. Remember, so the Service Women's Action Network. Which really, I think, was just getting started at the time. Now, the whole issue of violence against women in the militaries has really been well exposed. But at the time, SWAN was a very small group, and they were doing incredible work with very little resources. So they wrote a whole chapter in this briefing book and put their issue in front of the special rapporteur.
Thea, you might have much to contribute, and I'm curious, given the case example that you gave, whether you also kind of took the Justin approaching every rapporteur who could be involved, or you had the time to make a more strategic or deliberate choice in that.
Well, just on that last question, I would say that in this case, what we ended up doing was a little bit of a different approach. We already had a few pre-existing relationships with some of the rapporteurs, primarily special rapporteurs that are working in the field of economic, social, and cultural rights, but also the rapporteur on human rights. The situation of human rights defenders had been pretty responsive in the past. What we ended up doing was getting one strong ally among the mandate holders. I'll maybe leave her unnamed for now, her. And that individual mandate holder was in turn able to persuade a number of her other colleagues to join on board and to help articulate the merit of the case with their respective mandates, some of whom wouldn't probably have felt as comfortable dialoguing directly with the SCRnet representatives. That was maybe a different method used in that case in different circumstances. To the larger question, I just wanted to also share from the perspective of working with the groups in other parts of the world, oftentimes when I hear of human rights defenders asking for help accessing the special procedures mechanism, is coming from a place of feeling completely ignored and disrespected by their own local or national authorities. And there's a real disempowerment kind of that comes through in that request. And that raises a red flag for me oftentimes, because I find often, or sometimes, the default in those situations is to say, they're not listening to us here, so take it outside because they'll listen to the external. And we've talked in the earlier part of the day about how that can be positive, and I think it can be a very positive strategy, but it also, I think, at least from my perspective, the protagonists in any change process have to be the people who are affected directly by the injustice. That has to be central. The protagonists of change can't be someone far away. I mean, they can play a strong role in that strategy. But so, for example, in other cases where groups are campaigning on the ground, where they've started forging alliances, where they've started doing smart media work or social media work around an issue, and then they want to engage with special procedures in order for that attention to then ricochet back domestically to grow more space or credibility to help them win that argument, that often, from my perspective, feels like a more effective or kind of viable approach to actually achieving the stated goals. And the last thing I'll say is, I do think sometimes it's important to really help groups make sure that they have exhausted what they can do locally. So like a couple of years ago, I was approached by a group in the Philippines that's working with the urban poor, and they wanted us to reach out to the adequate housing mandate to issue an urgent appeal about a case involving an impending forcible eviction of a bunch of people that had been homeless and were in an encampment. It's a very serious case. But we had already sent several messages of a similar nature to that mandate that month, and it just felt like we were saturating. And so what we ended up doing, and I'm not a lawyer, by the way, but I can read the general comment and I can read the guiding, the guidelines. And I ended up just having a discussion with this. It was another grassroots leader on, this is what international law says about forced evictions, and this is what the Philippines has signed on to. Mm-hmm. Have you considered maybe finding a way to use these as talking points and dialoguing with the mayor? And she ended up doing that, being very inspired. She translated them to Tagalog. They ended up having a big public hearing around it. And the mayor, the first time of which he had heard this, ended up feeling very compelled by the argument and ended up putting his whole kind of political career behind exhausting eviction, alternatives to eviction. And in the end of that story, again, the families ended up being relocated to a site that they felt was adequate, probably not ideal, but adequate. And we avoided a worst-case scenario, and they never had to go up to the UN level. So that doesn't mean there aren't times when they do need to, but that we need to really, I really appreciate Amal's earlier question about that, and I do find there's a real danger in idealizing or some mythology around what the system can do, and also what the role is of civil society groups on the ground to make the change actually affect people's lives in practice.
Thank you, Thea. That was a great example and also an inspiring success. So that leads to my question that I want to ask Amanda, and that is, once you accept these visits by special rapporteurs or by working groups, and they make their country reports, what happens next in the U.S. government?
Thanks for that question. So as I think was mentioned previously, the U.S. does take seriously the opportunity that we have to respond to those recommendations in the remarks that we deliver in Geneva, and that process is quite deliberative. Having observed that for the Working Group on Discrimination Against Women in Policy and Practice, I can say we do take very, very seriously the recommendations that we receive, and we spend quite a bit of time making sure that we understand them. We follow up directly with the working group where we have questions or where we feel that certain points could be better nuanced, and then, of course, we prepare the remarks that we deliver at the Council. We then also take seriously, sort of this
role that we have to make sure that the state and local officials who were involved in the trip and even beyond that particular scope have access to these recommendations so that they're able to draw from them as they think through improvements to their policies or state and local law. So we want to be sure that as a conduit of sort of these particular mechanisms, that we, from beginning to end, make sure that the process, as enriching as it is made available to all of those who participate and those kind of beyond who may not have participated in that particular trip.
Thanks. I'm wondering if any of the panelists.
Yeah, okay. I'm wondering if any of the panelists would like to talk about their experience in follow-up to either special rapporteur or working group reports in terms of implementation or things you'd like to see done differently, both in terms of one's own role as a civil society advocate, but also in terms of the government at different levels. Go ahead, Amal.
Yes, I think one of the things that I find fascinating about the interactions between states, and not just the U.S. government and the UN system, is sort of the coherence that comes around a country visit and then how quickly that dissipates after the visit occurs. So all of this energy goes into the consultations that, Amanda, you described, getting everybody to engage in the process, et cetera. But the nature, perhaps, of government and of many different issues on people's agendas means that it's sort of like that energy just is lost. So, you know, what we're definitely have been engaging with the U.S. government on in the context of business and human rights is to build a broader-based and a clear interagency process to address these issues. It was not something that the working group recommended on its visit to the U.S., but it was something that the Obama administration undertook to do through this National Action Plan process. But, you know, that's just something that strikes me as you know, all of this energy is harnessed into a country visit, including resources by civil society, you know, getting people's hopes up. I think oftentimes in ways that we can't really deliver on around the country at the local level particularly, and then really seeing like, well, what occurred because of that, I think is just a challenge.
Anybody else?
Maybe just briefly to complement, I think often there's a lot of energy that gets galvanized in the lead up to an engagement. And I would love to see similar intensity sustaining that after the engagement has passed. So, for example, in a lot of the work with a lot of different UN mechanisms, there seems to be new alliances that are born or spring up or definitely are strengthened in order, for example, to submit a report to the UPR, again, to special procedures around a country visit, for example. Oftentimes we'll see that after that engagement is passed, that those kind of dissipate and fall away. I happen to think there's a lot of power in those alliances and that kind of social fabric between groups. And so to try to think about ways to sustain that afterward, and maybe that means finding other focal points for them to be able to collaborate around in order for that to sustain and be actually meaningful. Secondly, I do think, you know, oftentimes with a more effective engagement with special procedures and others, one of the things that is achieved is a greater recognition of the legitimacy of some of the voices that have been saying the whole time along that there's a problem. And there are prejudices in society that lead to those voices being silenced. And so if a positive engagement helps shed some of those and create a greater recognition for the legitimacy of those perspectives, then I think the onus is on all civil society groups, including the spokespeople that are at the center of the concern, to kind of hold that space and not allow it to close again. And I think lastly, at least in some parts of the world, and I would say, I assume in the U.S. as well, there's a huge aspect of just public education about, you know, what are human rights, what are our obligations, what are these mechanisms, and how important are they? And usually, particularly if there's some press around the outcome of these recommendations or country visits or things, you know, there is this kind of education of the media, public opinion more broadly, that are very important, and sometimes, in my perspective, even more important than the actual duty bearers themselves changing their minds. So to try to figure out also ways where that process can be sustained after an engagement, from my perspective, would really bode well, both for the issue that sparked the engagement, but also, of course, for the future issues that need similar attention.
Thanks, Thea. And I think this whole issue of media attention is one maybe we could just have one more round with the panel and then we'll take questions from the floor. But I can certainly say my experience in the U.S. with these last two working group visits, at least at a national press level, was there really wasn't much interest in those reports, even though they were really excellent and well thought through and responsive, I think, to what they had learned in their visits. So I'm just wondering what thoughts you all have, maybe at the local level it's been more effective, or other ideas to help educate, as you say, the press about the importance of the work of these UN mandate holders. I think most of them didn't even know what to make of the idea. So,
well, I would say working with the UN Working Group on Afro-Descendants, they got some good press around their recommendation for reparations. I'm not sure if it was more because of the nature of the recommendation being, in some people's view, something that is surprising or outrageous or something like that. But it really helped to provide a great deal of spotlight on the role of the working group, and they're now engaged in the process of developing a UN decade for Afro-descendants right now. And so we've been thinking about how we can continue to elevate that, whether it's an op-ed that you help to put together, opportunities for the mandate holder to engage in more writing, engage in blogging, if that's something that they're willing to do. Find ways to use that media for your own advocacy. So I do think, again, it comes back to engaging with the mandate holder, oftentimes informally. So most of my contact that has been most fruitful has been informal contact, where most of these special rapporteurs are passionate people doing it, for the passion of it without pay. And they're enthusiastic about learning about the situation on the ground. And so they're willing to engage if you're able to find yourself in an environment where you can sit down and engage with them. And so my most productive moments following up, whether it be for media purposes or for advocacy purposes, have really been informal moments. And trying to find ways to think creatively about how they can promote the work in the limited amount of space and time that they have. They have limited amounts of time in this position and limited amounts of resources. And they have their own politics to deal with internally, which we can also talk about with the Secretariat and other people who, to a greater or lesser extent, sometimes the Secretariat tries to set the agenda as opposed to facilitate the agenda. So those are all these things that you can try to engage the special rapporteur with and be a resource to them in what their agenda is, and so they can in return be a resource to you in what you're trying to get accomplished.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you. You've put a lot of additional issues on the table, but I see we don't have that much time left, so if it's agreeable, unless somebody has something absolutely burning they want to say at this moment, I'd like to give the group here a chance to ask questions. And if you could just say your name and the organization, because if you're sitting in the back, you really can't see the person, so please. Eric, you want to start? Say who you are. Everyone doesn't know you.
I'm Eric Hart of the National Law Center on Homelessness and Poverty. And in talking with some of the local groups about engaging with the special procedures, particularly around the confidential complaint mechanism, we emphasize, you send your complaint off, you can make it public, but for them it's a confidential procedure. It goes to the State Department, from you to the rapporteur, from the rapporteur to the U.S. mission to the State Department, and then they might communicate to your state or local officials to find out more about that issue. And so this is a question for Amanda. One of the things we tell them is, even if you're not getting a lot of public attention to it, at some point there's going to be a contact between, the federal government to a local official saying, look, we've got this complaint at the international level, what's going on locally? and hopefully, that person will all of a sudden have some twinge of, I'm in trouble or something like that. So, understanding that you probably can't talk about the specifics, what kind of awareness raising or what kind of, concern raising have you seen that have with any local officials as you or other people in the state or Justice Department interact with them as part of these communications?
Sure. Okay. Amanda's going to answer, and then we're going to take a couple of questions. Go ahead.
Sure. So thanks so much for your question, Eric. I unfortunately am not highly aware of our experience with that particular complaint mechanism. As long as I've been with the department, I've seen one such complaint come through. It did not, to my knowledge, involve state and local officials. But as a more general matter, I would say that I have found the most effective way to make the case that state and local actors should care and pay attention and be responsive is to really be as persistent as humanly possible. And that means reaching out through a variety of mechanisms. It means sending letters, follow-up letters, making phone calls. It means tapping personal connections where they may exist in the department. And I mean that in terms of where officials may have come across other local and state officials through different mechanisms, different realms of outreach that don't necessarily involve the special procedures. It means just sort of being extremely diligent about follow-through. And I think that's where we've seen, at least in the year that I've been with the department, that's where I have seen a consistent uptick in positive responses from state and local officials. I hope someday that there may be, a broader range of options for continued outreach and engagement with regard to special procedures and in terms of what the State Department is capable of doing. I would absolutely welcome all of the ideas that may exist in the room for how we can continue to be more effective, because I think in general what it results in, at least in terms of country visits, we'll just use that as an example, it results in really robust engagement. In terms of the particular inquiries that we provide back to the rapporteurs, it results in really specific detail that addresses, in the best case scenario, all of the questions asked, whether it's about any prosecutions that may have occurred in the context of the alleged violation or remedial action taken. I mean, we are of the mindset that the more fulsome a response or visit we can facilitate, the better for everybody involved. And I should say that I apologize for not acknowledging the crucial role of civil society in planning these country visits. I would be happy to make additional remarks if there's an interest in that, but I don't want to dominate this microphone, so I'm gonna end there. But please come up and ask about how I feel about civil society and country visits, because I have warm feelings about that. Thank you.
Can I just piggyback on that? Because one of the things I wanted to say was one of the benefits, I think, of working on these country visits is discovering allies in the government that you didn't know, and getting contacts, and then being able to work together, but also to call on people for more information or what have you.
This is so quick. And I will just say that through that interaction, I feel that we've actually achieved greater results in terms of seeking, for example, high-level meetings in certain cities that may not be responsive to me unilaterally or to civil society unilaterally. Because there's a bit of a force multiplying effect that can occur when we are approaching state and local actors from two different angles, but complementary angles. That's it. Thanks.
Okay. I'm going to call on Layla, and then we're going to try to find some people in the back of the room, and I apologize for my poor eyesight. Okay, so I'm going to let Layla ask her question, and then we'll go to the back.
And I'm going to keep Amanda on the hot seat, and that's the role you play. I did say that the U.S. had been quite constructive in its dealings with my mandate, and I would say that predates me, and certainly you were constructive when Raquel Rolnick came to the U.S. for her visit. But I have to say that constructive engagement isn't apparent all the time with respect to the right to housing. And in particular, as we're leading up to Habitat 3, the U.S. government's position has been quite obstructionist, in fact, with respect to the right to housing. finding company and bedfellow with China, not the most human rights friendly nation. And while I respect and understand that the U.S. hasn't ratified the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights and has only signed it, I feel it's unfair that the U.S. uses its power to hold hostage the whole world to its position. I was in India last month, and there are people there, as there are here, hanging from a thread. And those people believe they have the right to housing. There are people throughout Latin America, Europe, Eastern Europe, Asia, the Middle East, etc., all of whom believe they have the right to housing because it's in the Universal Declaration. And I think the U.S. has to show some humility and ask itself if it's playing fair when it holds hostage the whole world to its position. It is understandable, your position, but you can always, at the end of the day, rely on the fact that you haven't ratified. And that's for you to do domestically. So this is my provocative moment and my educative moment to urge the U.S. to play fair and to recognize what it's doing, not just to its own people, but to the world.
Thank you. I don't know if you want to respond or just let it go.
No, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, in the back, I really can't see who the hands are, so just bring them the microphone. Thank you.
Yeah, this is Tina Foster from the International Justice Network. And Justin, you alluded in your comments to the political process that, we see a lot of variation between rapporteurs and their willingness to take up certain issues. And I wonder if you feel comfortable maybe elaborating on what is a process, the political process that you're talking about, how the rapporteurs get to where they are to get to become rapporteurs. If you know. If not, it's not a fair question to you. I can defer it to somebody else. But
I'll say a very little bit, because I know a very little bit. But first of all, it's a difficult process to understand because oftentimes the outcome isn't what you would expect. As Amal mentioned, I think many times there are people who are appointed who do not have a great deal of expertise in all the aspects of the mandate. And that's what you would think they were appointed for, was their expertise. But I would say that there is a nominating process where there's a committee that creates some sort of scoring mechanism, and that to some extent that can be researched. But when I was talking about some of the political aspects of the process, I was speaking more about once either the committee member or the special rapporteur is already in place. Oftentimes there are pressures that we're not aware of that are working behind the scenes to work on some agenda points as opposed to others. There's sometimes, if you can gain a relationship with that special rapporteur, there are some instances where you can be of help if they're willing to divulge that information. I've had some experiences with some who have told me that their country pressures can come from other committees, pressures can come from other places inside of the United Nations. And so to the extent that you can find a way to be a support to the special rapporteur in their particular concerns, I found that they're willing to sit down and listen to you and go the extra mile in trying to help you with your special concerns.
other people on the panel would like to respond, I suggest you come up afterwards to talk to them because we're almost out of time, and I'd like to give a few more people a chance to ask questions. And maybe we could take 2 or 3 questions and then respond to them as a group. If there are. Okay, anybody else in the back? Because people in the front have a lot of questions. Okay, let me call on her and then you.
Hi, my name is Nahal Zamani. I'm with the Center for Constitutional Rights. I was just curious about the Obama administration's take on any outstanding requests for special rapporteurs to visit the U.S.
Okay, we're going to take 1 or 2 more questions. Go ahead.
So I'll just follow up. Nahal, we were partners on leading the work group of people of African descent. And one of the big challenges we had, we believed that the protocol is for the State Department to reach out to the local elected officials. Didn't happen in New York. And we were told we can't until the State Department does. But we did it anyway to get somebody in the room. So I would like to ask you, Amanda, what is the actual protocol and process? And and is there a way for us to reach out to the State Department and say, it didn't happen because the working group is asking to meet with local elected officials, and we couldn't make it happen because we felt there was a process in place that we had no control over.
I appreciate those questions. I'm just wondering, before Amanda answers, if there are any other questions that people have to other members of the panel. Joanne.
Thanks. So as we heard earlier, I think there's 41 different special procedures now or something like that. And Amal, you mentioned one of the challenges being sometimes your positions don't align with the work of the special procedures who sometimes don't have expertise in all the areas in which they're working. So I was curious if anyone had developed strategies and how to overcome or mitigate the harmful impacts when there is a statement of law or a statement of principles that you don't agree with, whether it's in the U.S. context or another one. Thank you.
Okay, so you want to answer that question, then we'll let Amanda answer the several questions she was asked.
Sure, I'll just jump in. I mean, and I'll perhaps be even more provocative in this perhaps my last remark. I think it's fascinating that this is the topic of today's discussion. I think it's very important, the engagement with UN special procedures. I see Gabor in the back, someone we've engaged with quite actively in his mandate. But I also think it's important for us to really underscore and recognize the political nature of this process, both of the appointments, the mandates that are written for the holders, and also what and how they effectuate their work. So that means to us, at least, and it's that we look at these cautiously, and we look at engagement with them cautiously. Where there is a bright superhero, like we saw earlier, then we'll engage fully. And then in that context, maybe we'll do even above and beyond, things like pay for some of their travel, offer them research support, staff their mandates. But that's very rare, I find. And we've just been in the process of 2 special mandates, both the appointment processes, one on the Working Group on Business and Human Rights, actually 2 members of that. And you just see like the most well-intentioned people who are doing it for the real belief in their ability to change things just get sliced out of the process because of political concerns, because the consultative group is composed of members including Russia right now. And we're seeing this in the context of the resolution on business and human rights, which will specifically not mention the word defenders because Russia is on the core group. So all this to say, it's just a political beast. And so with that, you have to take it for what it is.
Thanks, Amal. And maybe it's just worth noting that the United Nations is an intergovernmental body and that is comprised of member states. So take it from there. And now I'm going to let the representative of the U.S. government respond to the questions that were asked.
Thanks, June, and thanks to those who asked these questions. To the first question, in the absence of more specificity with regard to what that question communicated, I'm going to assume you're referring to the outstanding visit request by the Special Rapporteur on torture. And if that is actually the case, and please correct me if that's not the case, if that is the case, I can say we're aware that his term will come to an end at the end of October 2016. And we have been working with Rikers Island to ensure that they, maybe not to ensure, but to work with them to make clear that they have extended a request for him to visit their facilities. And as we've stated, I think actually quite recently, internal negotiations are still ongoing. We are still engaged in discussions with various agencies throughout the interagency on the Rapporteur's request for terms of access to other facilities that he may be interested in visiting. So again, please correct me if I am not tuning into. We're very much aware of the terms that he's requested, and we're continuing to have those discussions. To the second question, I would say I can describe the step-by-step process by which we reach out to state and local actors, and it typically begins with letters that we provide to these offices describing the mandate holder, what the mandate holder hopes to achieve, and encouraging strongly that state and local officials participate in a country visit. We then try and work as quickly as we can with the mandate holder to get a clear sense of the topics and issues that he or she, or the group, if it's the group, would like to raise in the context of those meetings. And that sort of marks the beginning of a dynamic and interactive exchange between my office and OHCHR, and my office and state and local officials. In terms of the specific example you provided with the working group of experts on people of African descent and access to officials in New York, I can say that from my understanding that's factually not true, because I myself prepared the letters that were transmitted to those offices, and I myself finalized and confirmed the meetings with the Attorney General's office, and I believe a general counsel at the mayor's office. I don't recall that we had any success securing access to a meeting or with the New York Police Department, unfortunately. But again, I think every country visit offers an opportunity for us to expand our ability to bring these stakeholders into the discussion, and I hope to see ever-increasing access to these folks, to their offices, and to their willingness to participate in what we think is a very important exercise. Thank you.
So unless somebody has something absolutely burning, Risa is signaling that this panel should come to a conclusion. So if that's all right, I'd like to thank all of our panelists, and I'd like to particularly thank Amanda for trying to answer the questions as best as humanly possible.
So I also want to thank the panel. I want to thank June for so ably facilitating a conversation here. So thank you all.